Welcome to everyone. I'm Stephen Bark and I'm Dean of King's Business School, and it's great to welcome you all here today. I'm actually going to sit down in a second. I mean, I am really struck by the gender balance in the room as I look around. I mean, I see Damien, but you know, I don't know what that says about. Well, I think it's something that we might debate over the course of the afternoon. But anyway, welcome to this first of our series of the SDG Workshops at King's Business School, which we're jointly hosting with the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. Now, clearly we're coming together at a very difficult time for the world. The invasion of Ukraine, violations of international law, on top of countries attempting to break free of the pandemic, continuing disruption in supply chains. So given the challenges that we've all had already and in the past, it's not an easy time to be progressing the SDGs. But despite that context, this series of workshops is a really fantastic initiative. And actually, I think it's the first of its kind in the UK academic community, with an explicit focus on the SDGs and research impact. And I really want to thank my colleagues, Damien Grimshaw, who you'll be hearing more from, and Sophia Bianchi. And the workshop series is designed to connect our world-leading academic research with international policy on the SDGs. And I think our ambition as a school and as a university is to strengthen the impact of King's research in the international policy community. Now, my sense is, and I think we have a shared feeling, or I hope we have a shared feeling in the room, that the UN's 2030 SDG Agenda deserves far more attention than it's getting. Clearly, it's a complex agenda of interconnecting targets and goals. There are clearly research gaps, and there's more to do to shape the national and international policy community and policy innovation. And I think in the UK, the SDGs are not where we need them to be in terms at the centre of UK government policy. And this is despite the potential they offer to catalyse and sustain central themes of inclusive and sustainable growth. And I was talking to a colleague working on levelling up as well, clearly key to that agenda as well. So the focus for this afternoon is SDG 5, equality and empowerment for all women and girls. And as I'm sure we'll hear this afternoon, the associated 9 targets each raise major challenges for what businesses, policymakers, civil society organisations need to do, and also for us in universities. We consider ourselves to be anchor institutions, so we have a key role in setting higher standards. And as you know, these standards include, amongst others, ending all forms of sex discrimination, improving the value we as members of society attach to unpaid domestic and care work, ensuring women's participation in effective leadership roles, equality in accessing and owning economic resources. And they're not just statistical targets, they shape the values that we all need to collectively hold. They certainly shape my work as Dean of the Business School, whether in ensuring gender equality in leadership roles, seeking to close the gender pay gap, or ensuring gender parity in interview panels and panels of this sort. So I'm very glad to see the innovative mix of policy experts and academics. Had the chance to chat to many of you over lunch, and I know that we're in for a very interesting afternoon today. Now, I'd like to express my thanks to the speakers today, and it's fantastic to see so many people here from the European Foundation in Dublin, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, parts of government, the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, and many academics at King's and beyond, from the business school, from the Policy Institute, and from our law faculty, and also from the University of Manchester's Work and Equalities Institute. Now, we're really fortunate today, and I'm really appreciative and delighted that we're joined by senior employment and gender policy experts from one of the foremost UN agencies, the ILO. Valeria Esquivel is a leading expert on SDGs and on women's experience in the world of work. She's internationally known among academics. She's a board member of the International Association for Feminist Economics, published extensively on the care economy and on gender and macroeconomic policy. Valeria is also a key player in shaping national and international policies, improving the working lives of women. Moreover, she edited a special edition of a book in 2016 on gender and the SDGs, or special issue, I think, and you're just completing a new handbook on this topic. So, Valeria, you're obviously the perfect person to have today to chair our workshop. Thank you so much on behalf of the Business School and of King's, and really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, to Damien for the invitation. I hope you can hear. So we are indeed for a great afternoon, and a fantastic colleagues who are going to present. So I will have the task to give you an overview of what the SDGs are and SDG 5 within that framework, and to keep time, basically, and to give you the floor. So that I would appreciate presenters here in the room and joining online to keep to the time, and I would lead by example by doing the same in this presentation. So I wanted to really touch base on Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, and in fact, COVID and several disruptions in the world economy that followed have really challenged, or at least, yes, certainly challenged implementation and the achievement of the goals that were set in 2015. And it looks like it was so long ago. And in fact, these were goals set to 2030, and now 2030 is round the corner. But I would like to emphasize that there are several differences between the 2030 agenda and the previous Millennium Development Goals. Several, a more, I would say, democratic or broad dialogue that built into getting to those goals. 17 goals in total. There were criticisms at the time that there were too many, and they will make governments go for the low-hanging fruit. But however, the fact that they brought the economic, the social, and environmental was a chance, and each SDG gave a platform to have these conversations going, broadened the development agenda. The other big difference with the MDGs is that this is a universal agenda. This is not for the underdeveloped, poor countries of the world. This is for everyone. And in talking to Damien, I was reminded that just after publishing that or editing that gender and development issue, I was invited by ODI, so I was here in London, and the questions were, is that for us as well? Yeah, certainly. Although we will see that, of course, targets are set in such a way that it's easier for developed countries to achieve them. I mean, of course, it's a universal, but the ambition, if you want, is bigger for poor countries or developing countries. The other thing, and this connects to SDG 5 in particular, is that that there is an intersectional approach taken in which there is a specific SDG, SDG 5, that is focusing on gender equality, but also gender equality is a cross-cutting issue along other SDGs. So in that sense, there was this dual approach in which there is a request or an ask to have gender disaggregated indicators as much as possible in other SDGs, but the focus is also on SDG 5, which means that there are, as were mentioned before, targets that are specific to gender equality, that make countries commit to achieve. Because again, perhaps I should have started there. These are commitments that countries have signed. They have committed themselves to achieve these goals, which also relates to one perhaps weakness of the SDGs, that because they are country-based, the ones that are global don't necessarily have the institutional infrastructure to make them move forward. The SDG of inequalities between countries, who deals with that? The climate change and environmental SDGs, okay, there are institutions there. The Addis Financing for Development conference that took place just before the 2015 meeting failed to produce an international tax authority, for example. So it is very much country-based, but we know, especially those of us who come from the South, that not everything is under the power, or not everything can be changed from a country perspective, even with the best intentions. In particular, and I come back to this idea of gender equality as a cross-cutting dimension, one interesting change in the language of this international agreement is that women are not listed as part of the vulnerable groups in themselves. The idea is that because of these intersectional inequalities, the fact that women are in certain situations or positions make them more vulnerable, but it's not an essentialist take on vulnerability. And we've moved away from this idea that listing this group and that group, another group, and women, no? Like half of the population couldn't be treated like that. And I wanted to emphasize that as a response to COVID, the Secretary General of the UN has come up with a new report, Our Common Agenda, just trying to reinvigorate the SDGs. And I won't read that, but these are the several targets that are under SDG 5, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. And these targets are associated to violence against women, to, I will read, to violence against women, to eliminate all forms of discrimination, harmful practices such as child early and forced marriage, and that's a kind of a group of targets. The recognition of the care agenda is one of the very important things that are there in SDG 5 and what we managed to call afterwards care policies, the investment in public service, infrastructure, as social protection policies that came together as a group of policies that were given really a strong push thanks to SDG 5. And then, as mentioned before, leadership and decision making and access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. The three last ones are kind of the policy refinement, if you want, because it's reforming, it's about technology and legislation. So the first five, if I recall correctly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, are kind of the targets, and the last three, like the means to achieve them. That's how it was structured. Because remember that at the very beginning, remember if you knew, but if not, I tell you, at the very beginning, the idea of the SDGs was not being prescriptive, not indicating the policies, but the results. And countries would be left to decide which policies to implement. But then along the lines, this changed. So, for example, instead of having a target associated to recognize, reduce, and redistribute unpaid care work, which was the proposed language, we have a target that says, okay, you do that via these policies, for example. So these are negotiated text, that it is something that has to be emphasized, given this is the first of this series about the SDGs. And as negotiated text, they have this, we don't ask this type of text to be an academic text. Several languages, several issues are brought to the debate in order for the consensus to emerge. And in fact, this is a very good consensus. The problem is we are far, far from achieving them. This is data from UN Women, who is the agency custodian of SDG 5. And what it shows is, first of all, it shows the targets. It's the targets that are listed, that were listed before in short form. And first, what doesn't have color, on the right, is where there is no information. All those targets, those are the countries that don't have information. So we need to progress on having information. That's the first thing to do. The second is that the blue ones are the achieved or almost achieved. You go from blue to red, far from achieving. And we see some progress, in particular in target 5.5 on leadership and 5.3 on harmful practices, if you want. But in others, there is less progress, or we don't have information about. And this is how it looks, and that I mentioned before. The countries that are going to have a review this year, you know that the countries are kindly requested to produce reports and present them. And there is no stick associated to not compliance. But if you have a look, and even the color gives you this idea that rich countries are achieving and are closer to achieve these goals than poorer countries, at least in the round of reviews that we are going to have this year. So where we stand, we are far from achieving, and we are 8 years down the line. So we are kind of midterm, if you want, in these 15 years. Lots of things to do. And in fact, the language nowadays in the UN is the accelerator, accelerate achievement, because if not, it's not going to happen. And in particular, now that the world is emerging from the COVID crisis, the issues of women's employment and pay and working conditions are really at the forefront, because we know, I was almost going to put some data in my presentation about how the impacts of COVID in women's employment, but I refrained because that's not the point today. But certainly they were heavily impacted, and more than men in most contexts. So in a way, we have had a setback, and we need to do a lot in a very short time. So in a way, that's the framework. I hope also it works as a explanation, or as a starting point of a broader conversation about the SDGs and today's conversation about SDG 5. So I think we are roughly okay with time. If it is okay with everyone, we move to the first panel. Stephen, if you would like to say anything.
No, just very true. I mean, well, now I'm saying something. I was really interested in the point about care services and the provision of public services, because you said, you know, that the SDGs did not, in a sense, will the ends. No, they will the ends, but not the means. But in a way, the language of public services is really interesting in a UK and other contexts, with the privatisation of care and things like that.
Absolutely, and we have demonstrated in the ILO that investment in care services, health and education are one way of exiting the crisis, in the sense that they create employment and good quality employment. They sustain aggregate demand, and they produce externalities, positive externalities, which in everyday terms is that they keep our lives going, and that is what that was something that feminist economists, we have been saying for ages, but now everyone knows that if we stopped, or we don't have quality health and quality education, the world stops. So in a way, that there is, I think we are, in particular about investments in care, we're somewhere else in the debate after COVID. And the Secretary General Accelerator for Jobs and Social Protection emphasizes investments in green economy and in the care economy. So it's really a very important and relevant agenda. Okay, thank you, Stephen, very much. And I will invite, without even catching my breath, I will invite Martina Vicello and Rose Cook from online, and Jill Rabbery to join me. Okay, so we follow the agenda. The agenda for today has basically three sections, if you want, after the opening. Two panels with a networking over coffee break, which Rose will miss, and then a policy panel. So the first of these conversations and presentations of research will have Martina Vicello, Rose Cook, and Jill Rabbery will be the discussant. So I will introduce each of you. I will pass the power of that, and then we move to a question and answer, if everyone is in agreement. Okay, so Martina is research manager at Eurofund, and Eurofund is the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions, a tripartite European Union agency based in Dublin. Martina has published many studies on labor markets and gender gaps in Europe, and her presentation is Women in the Labor Market in the EU, Long-Term Progress, Outstanding Challenges, and the Impact of COVID-19 Crisis. Martina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Valeria. I don't know if the title of my presentation or the organization I come from is the longest. So, I mean, the title already suggested it's going to be a rather rich presentation, but I really wanted to try to give kind of an overview and be as comprehensive as possible on long-term trends in terms of female labor market participation with a European focus, because as Valeria mentioned, I work for Eurofund. It's a European Union agency based in Dublin, for those of you who are not familiar with our work. We've been actually established in 1975, so we're quite old, and we basically work in producing knowledge-based evidence to assist in the development of employment, work-related and social policies. So at Eurofund, I mean, gender equality is a very important topic. We look at it from a kind of mainstreaming, cross-cutting perspective. For my own expertise, I'm more involved in labor market research, so that's kind of the main focus that I would like to present to you today. And actually, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the organizers. And I was chatting with Damien before the event, saying that this is my first in-person event since the pandemic, so it's really exciting to be here with you, especially discussing about such an important topic. If there is one message, takeaway message, let me anticipate that I would like you to bring home from today's presentation, is that the story of women in the labor market in the last few decades, I think, is a story of success, essentially, but there are still many outstanding challenges, and the COVID crisis, which Valeria referred to, showed us that the progress is still fragile and incomplete. So policy action is still needed, and I will touch upon some of the main measures as well, which I think are important to implement to address persisting. Here we are. Sorry, yes. No. Persisting problems. So just to give you a kind of to set the scene from a policy perspective, European policy perspective, gender equality, its core value of the EU. It's also a fundamental right, which is enshrined in the EU treaties. It is also a key principle of the European Pillar of Social Rights, which is a major initiative that was launched in 2017 to build a stronger, more inclusive and fairer social Europe. And in the context of implementing the European Pillar of Social Rights, the European Commission launched in March 2020 a kind of broader strategic framework, an umbrella, which is called the Gender Equality Strategy, which really set out the policy objectives and key actions for the period 2020-2025. And of course, the EU is also committed to gender equality through various international initiatives, such as the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals, and that's the reason why we're here today. Now, in terms of kind of broad gender equality progress, we published a study together with the European Gender Equality Institute, another agency of the European Union, where we look at progress in gender equality in the recent decades. And we saw that, yes, there has been a progress. It has been recorded in all member states, but it's still very slow and there's a long way to go. And if we look actually at the process of convergence among different member states, we see that on the positive side, the good news is that some of the countries, notably Mediterranean countries or some of the Baltics, which had a kind of lower level of gender equality a couple of decades ago, they progressed much faster, which is what you would hope, because there's kind of more room for improvement, let's say. But on the other hand, which is a little bit more worrying, you have other countries, especially in Eastern Europe, which, yes, they progress, but kind of slower than the EU average. So there are great divergences among differences among member states, which are important to keep in mind within the European context. Now, more specifically, in terms of female labor market participation, when we look at the gender employment gap, that is the difference between the male and female employment rates in the age brackets at 2064, we can see that there has been a declining of the gender employment gap. It's the solid green line that you see there in the graph. However, this is stagnating to some extent since 2013-14, and is still persistent, is around 11 percentage points. So it's still a persisting issue. Now, the fact that there is a gender employment gap has important implications, both from a social and economic perspective. You know, from a social perspective, women participation in the labor market is also a way of empowering women, of achieving their own goals and aspirations. But it has also an economic effect, and that's something that you, Valeria, were referring to earlier. And we also did some calculation, and we estimated actually that there is a monetary cost attached to the persistence of the gender employment gap, which is essentially due to missing foregone earnings, so missing earnings opportunity because women are not in the labor market, but on the other hand, also welfare state expenses. And we calculated that in Europe in 2018, it was around 320 billion of euros, so a quite substantial amount of money. So both social and economic implication of women exclusion from the labor market. Now, another interesting aspect is that while female employment grew in the last decades in Europe, segregation in the labor market is still a persisting issue. So jobs are actually not becoming more gender balanced as such. So I wanted to show you a graph here where we basically look at the employment share in the EU as a whole by gender concentration category, meaning that we group jobs in either female or mainly female, mixed, mainly men, or male-dominated jobs, depending on the share of both gender in those categories. And what we saw basically is that the employment expansion that we witnessed since the late 90s has been mainly concentrated in either mainly women or female-dominated jobs. And on the other hand, the share of mixed jobs has actually declined. And if we further break down these employment shifts by gender, it's basically clear if you look at the light blue bars to the left-hand side. It's clear that all the increase in female employment has been concentrated in jobs that were already female or mainly female dominated. And I think this is a very important point. Now, public sector employment has a role in this story in terms of boosting women employment. If we actually look again in the changes in the share of the employment between 98 and 2019 by gender in different sectors, grouping the public sector, so health, education, and public administration, we see that most of the employment growth has been in public sector employment. And if we further break down and look specifically at the sectors that were driving this trend, we can see the health professionals and teaching professionals really had recorded a significant increase, especially health professional of around 19 percentage points. Now, if we look at the job quality of these jobs where women are employed, on the one hand, there's a positive story in the sense that we can say that female employment is upgrading in the sense that women are taking up better paid jobs. So if we compare again well, in this case, it's a recent, it's a trend that we actually can notice in the last decades. Now I'm focusing on the most recent period, the 2011, 2019. So until the pre-COVID crisis, we can see that women tended to take up more higher paid jobs, and this is a positive development from an occupational perspective. We know that women are increasingly more employed in professional occupations, which tend to be more highly paid. So that's one side of the coin. It's positive news. On the other side, if we look at really the distribution, the employment distribution by type of jobs, ranking them from low, mid, and high paid jobs, we still see that women take up the majority of low paid jobs. So women are still predominantly taking up low paid jobs, although in the long term, the trend is positive. So we can see changes, things are changing, but still, like if we look at it as of today, from a kind of the really static perspective, that things are still not progressed as well as we would hope. Now there is another form of segregation in the labor market if we look at the type of contracts that women take up, and we know that women are highly overrepresented in part-time work. So around 3 out of 4 part-time jobs are held by women. Now the share of men in part-time work, it is increasing slowly over time in the last couple of decades, but still it's disproportionately taken up by women. And actually, it's interesting, again, if we look at part-time employment by different type of jobs classified depending on the concentration of male or female employment, we see that it's both for men and women that the highest share of part-time it's in female-dominated jobs. So it's not just for women, but also the highest share of part-time jobs among men is in female-dominated jobs. And we also know that the main reason for part-time employment for women it's care duties, care and family duties. This is something that is very relevant for what you, Valeria, mentioned earlier. Of course, I mean the issue of unpaid care work is one of the main challenges that needs to be overcome and be addressed. Family responsibilities and care responsibilities are not only a barrier to women participation to the labor market, but also to women full employment. Now, another issue, gender pay gap. The gender pay gap, it's narrowing in Europe, so that's also good news, but it's still there. It's around 14%, meaning that each hour women earn 14% less than men. As you can see in this graph, there's a huge variation in Europe across member states. You have member states with a rather high gender pay gap. You have some of the Baltics, Estonia and Latvia on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, you have others like Italy, Romania and Luxembourg. The gender, there are some counterintuitive results that one might wonder, like why in Italy, for instance, the gender pay gap is so low, but it's not necessarily. It's related to the fact that most likely there's a self-selection issue of women into the labor market. So those women that actually finally got a job and enter into the labor market are those that are more highly skilled, highly qualified, because they are not those that stay at home taking care of children, and so the pay gap is likely to be smaller. The pay gap, if we look at trends over time from 2010 to 2019, the pay gap actually reduced in 2/3 of EU countries, but it increased in 1/3, and mainly in those post-2004 accession countries. So again, these would be some of the Eastern European countries like Poland, but also Slovenia, and then Croatia as well. So there are some worrying trends that needs to be monitored. And also, if we look really at those that earned the least, it's worrying that. I'm gonna go fast. Thank you. It's worrying that to note that the female women are overrepresented among minimum wage earners. Mm-hmm. So it's not just an issue of gender pay gap as such, but also about minimum wages. Now, very briefly, I would like to touch upon the impact of the crisis on women. So if we look at aggregate employment figures, we don't see actually that the COVID crisis had a huge negative effect on female employment. But it's when actually we look at details that we see, the devil is in the details, let's say, that we see interesting differences. Because one of the most striking findings is that it's women in low-paid jobs that were hit the hardest by the COVID crisis, both in terms of job losses, but also they were more likely to be furloughed, so to reduce their working hours during the crisis. So that's one aspect of the kind of vulnerability that you were referring to, Valeria. And the main reason is that if we look at the sectoral impact of the crisis, there are huge differences. The COVID crisis can be described, as a tale of two sectors, a story of two sectors. You had the low-pay sectors requiring interpersonal interaction that are mainly female-dominated, that were hit the most by the crisis, and then you have the knowledge-based and the more office-based sectors that, of course, where the job could be simply performed from home, and of course they were sheltered from the worst effect of the crisis. At the same time, we also so basically women in low-paid sector were hit negatively by the crisis, but then there were also women working in office job that could go home and do their work there. And we can actually see that in terms of incidence of telework during the crisis, of regular telework especially, there's a tendency for women to telework more from home, at least compared to pre-crisis period. And also women are more likely to work in the so-called teleworkable jobs, in the sense that are jobs that are not place dependent, so they don't require like physical activities to be performed, like that would be in manufacturing or construction. So there is the chance that also if we think of the post-COVID outlook in the future, more women will end up teleworking. So just to wrap up, and apologies for taking a couple of minutes more, I think that the evidence, perhaps overwhelming, that I presented to you today, it really shows that there are some persistent challenges that needs to be addressed. First of all, we still have a gender employment gap, so boosting women employment must remain a priority. The European Commission set an even more ambitious target for reducing this gender employment gap, and I think that considering that the gender employment gap has been stagnating in the last few years, there's a substantial challenge that needs to be addressed. Even if women participate more in the labor market, gender segregation is still persistent across both occupation and jobs. And care responsibilities are one of the main reasons why women find it difficult both to participate in the labor market and to take up full-time jobs. And finally, I think it would be very interesting in the future to research more about the impact of telework and whether this will end up as a new form of segregation with women working from home remotely at the same time taking care of kids, because that suits them in a way, in the sense that it's more flexible, but it becomes an issue then in terms of visibility and career progression. Some of the published reports, in case you want to know more about it and read. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Martina. Devian, our presentation going to be available?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so because I've seen people taking pictures, so we will relax if we know that the presentations are going to be available.
Yeah, no, so the whole afternoon will be recorded, and then
okay.
Speak to the commission, we can put the slides on.
Sure.
Absolutely. I already have questions, but I will refrain from making them now. So I will pass the floor to Rose Cook, who will join us on the screen. And I hope, Rose, you are there. and we connect you whilst I present you. Rose is a King's College academic. She is Senior Research Fellow at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, and she leads on the Institute's research stream examining gender inequality at work. So Rose, wonderful that things are working and we have you here, and we see you and your presentation. So the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me and see me okay?
Yes, perfectly well. Thank you.
You can. Brilliant. So thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks also to Damien for the invitation to speak today. I'm really sorry that I wasn't able to be there in person. So I'll get started straight away, I think, with my presentation. So I'm ready to present, so I'm just going to share my screen now.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you see the slides now?
Yes. Yeah. And you. So perfect.
You can see me too. Okay, that's good.
Well.
Okay. So yeah, so my presentation today is on parenthood and job quality, and is there a motherhood penalty in the UK? So this paper is part of a 3-year project funded by Nuffield Foundation, which focuses on parenthood and job quality. And it's a collaboration with Laura Jones, who's a fellow researcher at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, and also Professor Sarah Connolly, who's based at the University of East Anglia. So many of us will be familiar with the idea of the motherhood penalty, which probably lies behind a lot of the statistics that Martina's just presented to us. So in the UK, for example, becoming a mother typically leads to earning less and working fewer hours than male counterparts. So that report that I've referenced by Andrew et al. From the IFS states that in the UK, 7 years after the birth of a first child, women's earnings are on average less than half of those of men. Meanwhile, there's increasing attention to job quality, so looking beyond pay to more focus on the experience of work and working conditions, which really shape people's lives in various ways, and I would argue are also a core part of thinking about gender equality in the workplace. So in terms of existing research about gender and parenthood and job quality, there's some evidence that women have worse job quality on different indicators, but it's unclear to what extent that's because of motherhood or because of gender or both. So that's really what we wanted to look into with this research. We also wanted to speak to a kind of theoretical debate around, I guess, the role of choice. So there's a theory of compensating differentials, which suggests that women sort of voluntarily give up some aspects of job quality, things like career progression and access to training, in order to gain others like flexibility, and that this is a trade-off that they're voluntarily making. Whereas there's also theory that would lead us to expect that women just have worse job quality on every single aspect of it, simply because of the devaluation of women's work. So that's something that we wanted to address as well. So our research questions: how does multi-dimensional job quality differ by gender and parenthood, and what's the role of working hours, sector and occupation in explaining any differences that we find? So you're probably wondering what exactly I mean by job quality. So for our analysis, we use data from Understanding Society, which is a household longitudinal study in the UK, and we used the data collected in 2016 to 2018 and focused on employees. And this survey collects data on individuals' job quality. We focus on 12 indicators which relate to prospects, working time intensity, non-wage rewards, task discretion, and work flexibility. So we're really interested in how jobs might combine good aspects of job quality and bad aspects as well, rather than just thinking about there's good jobs and there's bad jobs. Actually, there's many in between which combine different aspects. So I'll talk you through the indicators that we use. So in terms of working time, we looked at whether the person does overtime and works on weekends. In terms of prospects, whether they have access to training and feel they're likely to be promoted in the next year. Non-wage rewards, whether they get a pay rise, have access to pension schemes, whether they're salaried or paid by the hour, and whether they get bonuses or profit shares. Task discretion, so this is also, you could think of this as autonomy. So how much control people have over the way they do their job, how quickly they do their job, and the order in which they perform their tasks. Finally, flexibility, we looked at access to formal flexible working arrangements, access to informal flexible working arrangements, and the degree of control over when you start and finish work as well. So we used a method called latent class analysis, which basically groups these indicators into clusters. So looks at the ways that they combine based on individuals' responses, and create groups. And then we can then look at the groups that individuals are most likely to fall into based on their characteristics. So we came up with 6 groups ultimately. So these are our job quality clusters. So we found that based on those indicators, 27% of our sample overall were in what we termed high quality jobs. I'll explain a bit more about what each of these mean in a second. While 15% could be said to be in poor quality jobs. So that's like the good jobs and the bad jobs in the way that you might imagine. However, there were all of these intermediate categories as well. So jobs with high prospects and high rewards, but poor quality of working time. That was 14%. Low control and then medium rewards and prospects, 16%. Inflexible odd hours with low discretion, 10%. And then high control and low rewards and prospects at 17%. So basically jobs that can be termed high quality have high scores across all of the indicators. So that's fairly straightforward. And poor quality jobs have low scores across all of the indicators. But looking at the third class, so this high prospect, high reward and poor working time quality, employees have high levels of non-wage rewards, have a lot of autonomy in their jobs and a lot of flexibility, but they also have low working time quality, so working a lot of overtime, working weekends, but then at the same time they also have high prospects. So this is a kind of very mixed group where there are some good things about these jobs, but there are some bad things as well. So I'll move on in the interest of time to how are parents and non-parents and men and women distributed across these job quality clusters, which was our interest with this research. And I just wanted to draw attention to a few things. So most of the variation between these groups, so women without children, mothers, men without children and fathers, most of the variation comes with the intermediate categories, so not good jobs and bad jobs, but the jobs that are somewhat in between. So mothers, for example, are most likely to be in the group that we termed high control and low, but with low rewards and prospects. So this is people that have flexibility and a good degree of quality in working time, but low career progression and low non-wage rewards as well. In contrast, fathers were most likely to be in the group that I just described earlier, so high prospects, high rewards, but poor working time quality. So that's 22% of fathers compared to just 7% of mothers in that group. And then fathers overall were least likely to be in low quality jobs, so just 12% of fathers compared to 19% of mothers in poor quality jobs. So we made lots of different comparisons in our paper. So mothers compared to non-mothers. So what's the impact of parenthood for women, fathers versus non-fathers, the impact of parenthood for men, etc. So it all becomes fairly complex, but I just wanted to focus on two key comparisons that we made in the next couple of slides. Comparing mothers to fathers in our models, we found that mothers were much more likely to be in poor quality jobs and much more likely to be in jobs with high control but low rewards and prospects. So this is the like super flexible jobs with not much career progression. They were also more likely to be in this other category of slightly lower flexibility and then kind of medium rewards and prospects. They were less likely to be in high quality jobs and less likely to be in these high career progression, high reward, but poor working time quality jobs. So when we looked at this in our models, and we looked at the role of occupations and sectors and working hours, what we found is that differences that you see here largely disappear when controlling for working hours. So we think they're largely driven by women working in part-time jobs, mothers especially. Then thinking about mothers compared to non-mothers, so kind of the difference by parenthood for women only. Mothers were much more likely to be in poor quality jobs than non-mothers, and mothers were also more likely to be in the flexible lack of career progression jobs compared to non-mothers as well. But they were also less likely to be in the high progression, poor working time quality jobs and this other category of low control but medium rewards. And again, the differences disappear when we controlled for working hours. So there's a key role for part-time work in explaining job quality differences between mothers and fathers, but also between mothers and non-mothers. So just to summarize our quant findings, I did want to talk a little bit about our qualitative research as well, but let's see if there's time.
Like 2 minutes.
Sorry, 2 minutes.
Minutes.
Yeah. So women and mothers are underrepresented in high quality jobs and overrepresented in low quality jobs overall. There's evidence of a kind of trade-off for some mothers where they sacrifice career prospects but gain control and flexibility, but other mothers are just simply in all-round lower quality jobs. So it's important to bear this in mind when we're thinking about the role of choice. There's some evidence that fathers, one way of looking at it is that fathers sacrifice quality working time in favour of prospects and career progression, and you might want to refer to this as a fatherhood penalty, but maybe we can discuss that. Working part-time is a strong driver of the differences that we saw. But also important to say that we also see gender differences in job quality, which are actually nothing to do with motherhood and nothing to do with working time. And that's something that's a bit harder to explain, that needs further investigation. I wanted to just highlight a couple of quotes from the qualitative research that we did, which was really focused on the role of choice and how people explain and justify the jobs that they end up in as parents, and just thinking about this idea of trading off the career progression in favour of flexibility. whereas you may think this could be a positive choice, most of the women that we spoke to in our focus groups really framed this highly negatively, saw it as something that they were forced to do and were extremely unhappy about. So, for example, this mother said, you know how they say you can't have it all, you really can't have it all. Sacrifices you've got to make your bed and lie in it, so you're tormented. In contrast, we spoke to a father who'd made a similar kind of choice of working flexibly but earning less and having less career progression and kind of, I guess, feeling like his job was less of a career and more something that paid the bills. He spoke about it in a completely different way. So he said, I know I've come to sacrifice some stuff, but I've not found it as a negative. I want to look back in 20 years and think I've been there for the kids right through. So there's something interesting here to reflect on in terms of how people frame the way that they're working and where, to the extent to which it's choice and the extent to which it is related to kind of identity and gender roles as well. So I probably don't have time to say much more. I was going to say something about the next steps with the research, but I can maybe mention that later. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to Nuffield who funded the research, and to my co-authors as well.
Thank you, Rose. Before passing the floor to Jill for comments, could you tell us these mothers and fathers of children of which age? Where's your cutting point for defining someone as a mother or as a father?
Yeah, so it's children under 18 who live in the household.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Okay, so I will pass the floor to our first discussant, Jill Robbery. You may all know her, but Jill is Professor of Comparative Employment Systems at the University of Manchester. She's very well known, indeed, in policy and academic circles for her extensive research on gender inequalities in the world of work, especially on issues of equal pay, low pay, working time, and inclusive labor markets. So she's perfectly positioned to be our discussant today. Jill, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, thanks to Martina and to Rose for the papers. This is a very wide-ranging session because we start with SDG 5 and the fact that that covers the whole world, and yet the papers are more European and UK focused. So I apologise that my discussion comments will be focused there as well. And we've seen that there's been progress in some dimensions, but continuing problems. And I wanted to focus on 4 issues. Issues of care and parenthood and the impact on job quality and employment type, issues of value attached to the work women do, issues of gender segregation, why it persists and what role it plays. Is it always negative? And what's, maybe if I have time, something on what the future holds and the role of crises and new technologies and all the other current debates. So I won't cover all of that. But I want to start with this issue about parenthood. And I thought it's really interesting and novel sort of way of looking at it, to have these multi-dimensions and these you're bookending with high quality and low quality, and then these intermediate categories. And that's very useful. I'm not quite certain how you come to classify them as high rewards when you're not using pay. I hadn't actually fully appreciated that. So some of my comments were assuming that pay was somehow embedded in there, but it's not. And I just wonder whether those non-pay rewards are a good proxy for rewards or not. I think that's an empirical question that maybe needs. But the real point I wanted to focus on was, is it really a trade-off or choice by women? Or what's the role of employers in this context? To what extent are employers making the choice for women rather than the women choosing to trade off? In the work I did with Damien for the ILO on the motherhood pay gap, we found quite a lot of studies which suggest that employers simply allocate women to career structures that, if they have children and working part-time, that offer no prospects. And so it's employers that are doing that. And equally, when it comes to pay and rewards, are employers taking advantage of women being constrained by their household and their care responsibilities and paying them lower wages because of flexibility, when the flexibility has no cost to the employer. They're simply, you know, if you like, it's a monopsonistic kind of behaviour on the part of the employer. So I think there's a danger of treating those in between categories as trade-offs that are choices by women, and not looking at the structure of jobs that generate those wide range of different ways in which quality of jobs combine, different aspects of the quality of jobs combine. And I think if you were, for example, to look, and this links into a point that was made by Martina, more at, if you like, the public sector versus private sector, you will find that, I mean, the public sector has been, I think, making more and more use of the fact that women are a very skilled graduate labour force, but doesn't necessarily command the same level of pay and rewards as a male graduate labour force. And, you know, this high quality jobs, I mean, most graduate jobs will end up in the high quality jobs, but if you differentiate it amongst that, you find the similar kinds of trade-offs. But I would argue it's the employer, the public sector, making, you know, providing better flexibility and quality, but making certain that it takes back that advantage through lower pay, particularly in the post-austerity period. So that also links into what I was saying about value attached to women's work. I think these jobs don't exist independently of who's occupying them. And that doesn't necessarily, and that includes both individual bargains and packages that people negotiate, but also the way in which, as we've seen, this gender segregation in the labour market enables employers to, if you like, target the whole way in which they organise a job, because it's mainly women and many of them will have children. You know, so it's both individual packages and more employer strategies, I think. So I think there's those kind of issues about the value of work, and I think, you know, this is a real issue. I haven't got too much time, so I'll just move on then to issues of gender segregation, which Martina's was presenting on. And I think it's really interesting that we're seeing this increasing share of female segregated employment. And again, I suspect it's linked to the care agenda, to public sector and all the rest of it. And those figures about the percentage of teachers and health professionals is really quite dramatic and really needs more attention. My guess is, Martina will be able to tell, is that when you show the declining mixed occupations, that is actually the occupations that were mixed, already mixed in the 90s, and then it's the same set of occupations. But what was also interesting is to see whether more mixed occupation, more of those occupations that have been declining have also become more female segregated. So if they were reclassified, would they be in the female segregated or remain in the mixed category? And it's that tendency for mixing of occupations to be the start of a process of segregation that I think actually leads me to question the recommendation that the way forward is for younger women to think about entering male occupations. I mean, there was a lot of fuss, you know, about women and new technologies, etc. And women not doing coding. And I said, well, I'm sure that if women were the main coders, the occupation would be low paid and low quality. And so, the actual entry into a male occupation doesn't protect it from being further changed and becoming low paid and gendered and this trade-off taking place. So I think there is a sort of problem that, assuming that creating a mixed occupation is the end of the process rather than the beginning of maybe a bifurcation of the occupation into lower paid categories and higher paid categories is probably a better way to think about it. I think what we've seen through that growth of employment in female segregated occupations is that actually segregation, to some extent, is a protection for women in certain contexts. It's not necessarily something that's all bad. And the jobs that women do in those occupations are also very useful. So they're not jobs that we necessarily want to get rid of. They may be low paid, they may offer a few career prospects, but they're not necessarily jobs that we necessarily want to do without. So I think, again, we have to think quite carefully about what the recommendation is and not simply, I mean, it sounds bad, gender segregation, and in a more equal world, one wouldn't have it, but or wouldn't necessarily have it. But I think that in terms of policy recommendations, it's not necessarily where I would start. And so the question is, does gender segregation provide protection, or does it provide exposure? And my own work on, women in crises, I've written books on women in recession and women in austerity, suggests that the nature of the crisis matters. It does really matter. And that we've seen that very much in COVID, that it was women's concentration in hospitality and retail and things that led to loss of low-paid jobs. And some of those changes may be permanent, probably in retail, but probably not in hospitality. I mean, that does depend on whether the world changes and we have less socializing. Will we be going out as much to eat and socialize, or will we not, simply because we actually more isolated, we work more from home? These things will change, but the point is that that was a sort of short-term effect. I think what's more interesting is the longer-term effect of crises, because crises usually immediately impact by the current pattern of gender segregation. But as we recover from crises, maybe the whole impact of the crisis is to open up opportunities for further changes. And women can then substitute for men, or men substitute for women in ways that is not possible in the immediate period of the crisis. And that's why I wanted to pick up a little bit more on the telework aspect, because it does seem to me that that is a major challenge for women. I think we're already seeing tendencies for higher qualified professional women to be working from home and under pressure to reduce their quite dramatic expenditures on formal childcare. I mean, it will differ across countries. In the UK, with the childcare cost being so enormous, most families will see a major benefits from cutting back on childcare. But what we may then end up with is exactly what has been suggested, this segregated women working from home and combining care and work, and not making less use of formalised childcare. And that, because it's the better off women who may be cutting back, will make it more difficult for both those professional women who need to go to work and those go out of their house to work, and a lot of the frontline workers to find childcare in a privatised childcare market, which makes it even more important that it's a public provision. So I think that's I mean, we already hear that, we already know that in the UK you can't get after school clubs or holiday clubs in the more deprived areas because people don't have the money to pay for them. And if those people who have the money to pay for them are doing it themselves by working from home, then those who really need it are not going to have any opportunities. So I think this is just to suggest that there are lots of things going on, and clearly the future of work for women does depend on what's going to happen under new technologies, the next round. I know this was a major topic in ILO when Damien was there. But I think it is mixed up with COVID, because COVID has changed expectations, and this will be a major factor. I think what I would like to say in terms, just very quickly, on what needs to be done is that we need to really focus on what's happening in the job market and not just in the gender side in order to know what's happening. And my takeaway from what's been said about parenting, what's been said about gender segregation and all these other issues, is that we do need to bring back the idea of shorter working hours for men and longer working hours for women, that are moving towards more of an equal hours of work for men and women. Without that, we really have limited prospect of any gender equality. We heard about it in terms of the part-time work being a major driver of the low quality jobs. But equally, it's clearly not sustainable or desirable that both parents would work the excessively long hours that often involved, certainly in the UK, of working full time. So I think, we do need to think, and this links into Valerie's, your thing about the problem with the SDGs, that they didn't really reimagine the world. They focused on women getting more equal position in the existing world, and whether that's compatible with gender equality is something we have to question. And I think we need to reimagine these job structures and recognise that these trade-offs are driven to a large extent by what employers can benefit from. And so, yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Jill. Yes, as fixing the women or fixing the world, as Sylvia Chant used to say. Let me, I will pass the floor we have like almost 15 minutes, a little less, for Q&A. So think about your questions, and we will have a round of questions before. And so this gives time to Rose and Martina to think about any possible response to Jill's comments. Let me just emphasize two things. One is that in comparison, in the international comparison, certainly women in Europe did much better than in the rest of the world, and that is associated to the policies that were put in place to keep women in their jobs. It is a lesson from previous crises, and we at the ILO have said that women, if they lose their jobs, it's harder for them to come back to the labor force. And that is clearly the difference between the policies put in place in Europe in general as compared to in other places where those policies were not in place. Women lost their jobs and therefore were falling behind. So the policy aspect, especially in Martinez, I was missing. What are the policies that could explain or have explained the findings, and also the debate on low skills, because when I think you said both, Martina, the low skill associated to certain sectors that employ low-skilled women. But the point is that when we speak about the low skill, the immediate policies recommendation is skilled women, as if this structural reason why they are employed in sectors that were hard hit would be avoided. In other words, you could end up with overskilled, or overqualified women with the same bad quality jobs. So I wanted to bring that up. So let's do a round of questions. Yes, just one thing I've been told, a technical thing. You have to tap and to speak, but no more than two people can be tapping at the same time. So when you finish your question, you have to come and turn it off again. Okay, please introduce yourself.
Can you please work?
But it has to work because if not, we are not going to be able to record it. So it's red. I think it turns red. Yes, perfect.
So I'm Liz Hind. I'm from the Fabian Society. I ought to kind of introduce that at the start of the pandemic, I was earning a living by running a pub as a business owner with my own limited company. So I have some very particular perspectives on what's happening with the hospitality industry, because of course I am now unemployed, which was not inevitable. And I speak to a lot of women who were running their own business at the start of the pandemic who feel that, and I agree with them, that there was more support for male type businesses like pubs than, you know, your beautician, your hairdresser and wedding organisers and those sort of traditional women's businesses. So I think my question is, you know, what's being done to understand women's ownership of business, because the SDG talks about ownership, not just waiting around for somebody to employ you. And some of the things that you're talking about with employers, would that situation be better if we had more women-owned businesses and more women who are the employer rather than the employee? Because and where's data is my last sort of point to that question, because I see very little data coming out about women's ownership of business, and from what I can see in the UK, it's actually going backwards. So there you go. That's lots of talking points there.
Thank you. Who else? Yes, please. On. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
My name's Caroline Ericks, And firstly, thank you all so much for coming and sharing your time today. It's been fascinating, everything that you've said so far. It's all been really interesting. My background is in finance and in banking. That's been my primary career. And when you sit down with international bankers and central bankers and chancellors, I think we'd all agree, they're the puppet masters that kind of control the world's money, every currency. And they often speak of the invisible hand, and that's the invisible hand that allocates wealth in certain directions to certain groups of people. And my kind of question to all of you, I mean, it's kind of over and above the minutiae of going into the statistics, but who is policing the invisible hand to ensure that it's doing its job properly and making sure that people aren't left behind and people aren't exploited and people aren't put into vulnerable situations because of the allocation of money?
Thank you. Yes. Okay, so let me do this. I will take this. Well, yes, I will take them all and then we go back, because if not, we won't have time. So yes, please go ahead.
Hi there, I'm Dawn Bonfield, so I'm from the engineering sector. You didn't mention anything about women in engineering and STEM sectors really, and I think one of the things that's really important there is that without women in those particular sectors, then we are not allowing, this is where the future world is built, and if we don't have a mix of gender in those professions, then we won't be influencing the world that gets built. And I think we're trying to move away, and especially in those professions, from calling things male dominated to predominantly male, and it's a subtle change, but it's kind of makes a difference. And with the social mobility czar recently speaking about girls in physics, I wonder if you could comment on your thoughts about what she said.
Thank you. Okay, I have two. So there, and there. You said first, yes.
Thanks very much. My name's Ewan McGahey. I'm from the law school. Thank you for the fantastic presentations and really interesting research. I wanted to ask what would be the best policy measures to eliminate the gender pay gaps and the Motherhood Penalty. In particular, I'm just wondering if you could comment on two things. I think both have sort of been mentioned, but equalising parental leave so that there aren't any gender distinctions anymore, and also free childcare at work. At an unnamed university, an unnamed trade union has put forward these policies, but because we see all the time that, we see cases of people applying for maternity leave and being told that they're going to be redundant, and just sort of shocking things. And we're sort of thinking that, if we take the gender distinctions out of parental leave, then that might have an effect. I know that there's some evidence, but I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Excellent. And last but not least.
My name is Samar Hishaimi and I work in strategy consulting. Actually, building on what Ewan said, the maternity gap, or the maternity, what was it called again? Penalty is actually impacting all women, not just mothers, because the research, as I see it, is talking about women or people in employment already, but the entry point is where I've seen a lot of women not getting hired by because there's the potential of them becoming mothers at some point, and company owners do not want to take the risk of a woman becoming a mother, losing the money and the time with that. And with the lady was talking about in terms of STEM and in terms of business ownership, in terms of STEM and in terms of consulting, what I've seen is a lot of women ended up creating their firms and their own consulting firms because they couldn't enter into the spaces of STEM and consulting. But then, same as the lady here, during the pandemic, we actually ended up getting penalized a lot in terms of getting jobs and getting support during the pandemic. So it's a completely vicious loop.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. I think I'll pass the floor in the order we have taken. We don't have much time, and Damien has insisted on the coffee in time. So a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Of course, we can continue the conversation over coffee, but not with Rose. So a couple of minutes to Martina, and then the floor to Rose.
Yeah, thank you. Very challenging because there's so many interesting things. So, I mean, just a couple of reflections on segregation, and thank you, Jill, for bringing that up. I mean, it's a rather complex issue. As probably I was rushing through the policy pointers at the end, but you know, I think that tackling segregation should come both from the labor market and also the educational system, and more widely fighting gender stereotypes and issues with gender roles, which are still deep in our society. I think there's an issue not only with the segregation as such, but with the working condition as well. So, you know, it's beyond the choice of the type of work that then is done by women, but there are issues in relation to working conditions and pay is one element. But also, if I think of healthcare professionals, which were so central during the COVID crisis, issues in relation to work intensity as well, and job quality and stress, and being subject to physical and verbal abuse. So, and in the long-term care workforce, this is even more clear as an issue. And then we have issues of intersectionality, because as many women are migrant women. So it's very, very complex. But I agree with you. I mean, the issue of it's not about really just eliminating just making sure that, I mean, all jobs are gender mixed. There are some deeper issues in terms of working conditions that we need to address there. And I think one issue in relation to working time flexibility, it's really key. I remember reading this paper was published a few years ago by Claudia Goldin in the American Economic Review about the last chapter of this grand gender convergence, which is really about addressing the problem of the disproportionate reward that is given especially to a certain type of jobs and jobs that are male dominated in terms of working long hours and working certain hours of the day. Now, I think on some of the issues I'm just trying to select here some of the issue in relation to how to address best the policy measure to eliminate the gender pay gap. I think I will come back to some of them maybe in the policy session, because those are very relevant points, and there are some relevant initiatives taking place at the European level. Then on the issue of low skill jobs, I mean, the way we rank jobs in terms of job quality was taking wages as a proxy, but of course, wages just one very narrow dimension of job quality. If you do rank jobs by educational achievement or proxy and skills, you do see differences by gender, and there is a tendency of women ending up in lower paid jobs but having higher qualification, exactly as you mentioned. So that's an additional layer of complexity that should be taken into account. Well, I have many other thoughts, but I think I'll keep it maybe for the coffee break or the panel discussion.
Thank you, Martina. Yes, so many things, and I think we will be able to make conversation hopefully in the two panels that come. Rose, the floor yours for a couple of minutes.
Thank you. Yes, just very briefly, thank you very much for all the questions and the comments from Jill. I wanted to pick up on the point that Jill was making about choices and how a lot of these job quality differences are the result of choices made by employers. I totally agree, and it's something that, I mean, I think we do get quite individualized when we're looking at kind of quantitative and survey data, but in our qualitative research, it definitely came through really strongly in terms of a lot of people saying that jobs with prospects or kind of career type jobs just aren't available part-time or flexibly. They just can't find jobs like that. They're just not there, and that was across many different industries as well. And so this, you know, women being overqualified for the jobs that they're doing because they need the part-time or the flexibility was a massive issue, and it wasn't their choice at all. And then on the sector issue, we did look at, we thought that distinguishing between public sector and private sector would make a difference to some of the differences that we found in the models, but actually it didn't at all. Like, working hours was really the only thing that seemed to make a difference, interestingly. And then in terms of some of the questions from the floor, there was a question from somebody about the lack of research on women's ownership of businesses and kind of entrepreneurship. I know there's a researcher called Julia Rouse at Manchester Metropolitan University who looks into this in great detail, so you might want to look up her work. But I agree that it is under-researched. In terms of policy measures to eliminate the gender pay gap, obviously a massive conversation, but I do want to highlight the role of working hours, and, you know, what Jill was saying about men working less and women working more, and this could have quite a transformative effect, I think. Yeah, that's all I have time for, I think.
Thank you, Rose, very much, and thank you everyone for your questions. So now we have time for coffee. We come back at 3:30. Thank you very much. So Jeanette is joining us on the screen, is Professor of Human Resource Management here at King's Business School, and she has published widely on the changing nature of work, especially on careers, work-life balance, and well.
So thanks to the workshop organisers for giving me the opportunity to present today, and I hope it'll be of some interest. I'm sorry I can't be with you physically. What I want to do today is to talk about research that I've conducted on the legislation that is commonly referred to as the UK Gender Pay Gap Reporting Regulations. And these regulations were enacted into law in 2017, and we're just coming up to, if you like, the 5th year that the regulations have been in existence. And I think the regulations are interesting in all sorts of ways. But what I was particularly interested in was how business organisations were responding and reacting to those regulations, and especially the ways in which human resource managers, I'm a professor of human resource management, so that's kind of natural interest, how human resource managers were perceiving and interpreting the regulations, and how those perceptions and interpretations were changing over time. So I was interested in this because when a new law is enacted, it constitutes a major change in the external environment in which organisations operate. New legislation engenders considerable uncertainty which organisations have to navigate, and in particular social actors within those organisations. So I'm interested in the way in which stakeholders respond to the uncertainty engendered by new legislation, and in particular human resource managers, who I would argue are influential organisational actors in the context of this particular legislation. And I'll say why I think that in a little while. So why were the regulations enacted? Well, although 5 decades have passed since equal pay laws were enacted, women continue to receive significantly lower pay and fewer promotions than many men in many workplaces. And as we know, they tend to be underrepresented in the highest levels in organisations. So the persistence of these gender inequalities have been recognised as constituting a grand challenge that requires concerted governmental and organisational actions. These new regulations were heralded as a central plank of the government's strategy to reduce the gender pay gap in a generation. And this is what the UK Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May, said about them in 2017. She argued that tackling injustices like the gender pay gap is part of building a country that works for everyone, The gender pay gap isn't going to close on its own. We all need to be taking sustained action to make sure we address this. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the regulations, so I'm going to move through this pretty quickly, but essentially organisations that meet a particular size threshold, which is that they employ over 250 employees, they have to publish a set of data relating to the gender pay gap, and failure to publish is unlawful. So they have to publish these kinds of statistics, their mean and median gender pay gaps. They have to publish information about the bonus gender pay gaps, and also the proportion of men and women in each of the 4 pay quartiles. So in the first year of enactment, it was observed that 10,500 employers reported. It was argued that this met full compliance. It's often been pointed out that whilst employers are encouraged to include a narrative explaining any pay gaps, that it's not mandatory. Having said that, in the year 2018 to 19, around half of private sector employers did publish some kind of a narrative. They tend to be quite short, but you know, many do. Clearly, there's a distinction to be made between the gender pay gap and equal pay. The former doesn't show differences in pay for the same or comparable jobs. It's affected by all kinds of things. It's affected by the proportion of men and women in different occupations at different levels of an occupation and an organisation, and the numbers of people working part-time. The trend is downwards in the UK gender pay gap. It was 27.5% in 1997. And it's now hit 15.4% in 2021. So, you know, the trend is quite markedly downwards. So if I can just move on now to talk about what my research involved, which is essentially trying to understand stakeholder perspectives, and particularly human resource managers. Human resource managers, I would argue, are important from 2 perspectives. One is that they are implementers of the legislation. And in fact, the responsibilities of human resource professionals in the context of this legislation is pretty substantial. They are typically involved in the computation, the generation and reporting of the gender pay gap statistics and the writing of any accompanying narrative. They are also likely to be actively engaged in the development of protocols and practices designed to mitigate the gender pay gap. And particularly in the pre-report stage, when the legislation was first enacted in 2017, they really had to develop quite quickly an understanding of the content and meaning of the regulations, including acceptable models of compliance. In fact, the Royal Statistical Society noted that with the introduction of reporting, the government was in effect asking human resource professionals to take on important statistical responsibilities. And this is how one statistician who is associated with the Royal Statistical Society depicted human resource professionals when he gave oral evidence to the Treasury Committee a few years ago on the effectiveness of gender pay gap reporting. So he said, one of my biggest concerns is that the people who are being tasked with doing the analysis and preparing the action plans are the HR professionals. I feel HR professionals probably have some of the least statistical skills you will ever find. Now, this is not a terribly flattering portrayal of human resource professionals and of professionals in what is actually a predominantly feminized profession. I think he's being rather unflattering because I have considerably more respect for the caliber and capabilities, data analytic capabilities of HR managers. So they're important to implementers, but they're also very important interpreters. And there is a literature about this. There's research on this that suggests that HR managers can act as influential issue interpreters within organisations as well as gatekeepers, in the sense that they influence how the meaning of an issue is constructed in organisations. And in particular, they can determine which HR issues to bring to the attention of top managers. And this has been demonstrated in the context of the adoption by organisations of work-life policies. Researchers found that differences in the weight placed by HR managers on the importance of work-life issues actually explained a good deal of variance in organisations' subsequent adoption of work-life policies. So HR professionals, important implementers and influential issue interpreters. So if I can move on to say a little bit about my research now, and I'm going to present you with a slice of the data, and by no means all the data. And what I wanted to do was to do a longitudinal piece of research. I wanted to capture organisations before they first reported their statistics publicly, and then try and catch up with them in a period that I labelled time 2, after they'd actually engaged with the reporting exercise reasonably substantially. So after 2 or 3 public reports, so 2 to 3 years later. And I initially studied 19 organisations before the first public report. And I did this actually in conjunction with a consulting firm called Mercer Consulting, which is a big global HR consulting firm. They were interested in the research and facilitated, to an extent, access to some of these organisations. I actually didn't find it, quite interestingly, didn't find it particularly easy gaining access to organisations at this time. I think they were very concerned about negative media scrutiny. In the second stage, I managed to get 9 organisations, continuity in 9 organisations, and it's predictable when you do longitudinal work that you get attrition. This is a particular problem when you study HR managers, as the turnover rates are quite high. They move on either within or outside of their organisations. And I also ran up against the first COVID lockdown, so it was, it wasn't particularly easy research to do. But I did get a wealth, I think, of data from these 9 organisations. They're quite diverse. They span diverse sectors, so banking, financial services, industrial products, manufacturing, engineering, technology, science, leisure and entertainment, sales, service, distribution, and also higher education. There's a diversity of size, there's a diversity of sophistication of the HR function, and also a diversity in terms of the range of their median gender pay gaps. And these figures are averaged over the 3 years that's kind of span the research, really. So they span from a negative figure, so a gender pay gap that favoured women, to one that was 39%, so which is on the large size. So in terms of what I want to now talk about was, how they looked at the legislation, how they looked at the regulations. So, and I'll present a slice of the data. And I want to really extract 2, if you like, broad, frames, interpretive frames. One was they looked upon the legislation as an organisational opportunity. The second interpretive frame was they looked upon it as a regulatory burden. So if I can deal with the interpretive frame of organisational opportunity first, there were two important sub-themes to this. One was the theme of normative commitment, and the second theme was that they viewed it as an impetus for change. So let me just deal with the sub-theme of normative commitment. First of all, overall, they expressed normative commitment to the regulations across both time periods, but they were careful about how they expressed this. They talked about liking the intent of the regulations, but they distinguished between the intent and the execution of the regulations, which they didn't like so much. mainly due to what they perceived as a lack of clarity, undue complexity, and what they believed were serious anomalies in how pay was defined. And I'll say a little bit more about this later on. So as you can see here, you know, in time one, they said, we really love, one informant said, we really love the intent. We're really supportive of efforts to increase female participation at more senior levels. You know, in all my conversations with our lawyers, what I boiled it down to was the intent of the legislation and so on. And in time two, as you can see here, there's a distinction between the intention behind what the legislation is there for, which the informant thought was the right thing to do, but I definitely grumble about the way we have to do it. So referring there to execution. The second expression of normative commitment was the fact that they often referred to the degree of senior executive support for the legislation. So in time one, they talked about credible senior leadership, touting it, advocating it, a large level of engagement at senior levels. And this carried on into time two. So there was generally stability in the support of the legislation over the two time periods, but there were one or two exceptions in the sense that, as you can see from the second quote from Vehicle Co, the interview said, our senior managers are less interested than I thought they might be, and linked it to, if you like, the lessening or waning of interest from government and media. The second theme here was that they did identify the legislation as an impetus for change. So they argued it prompted discussion in organisations. They said that the regulations had put it on people's radar, that there were more senior conversations about gender inequality and pay inequalities and so on. And this was sustained over the two time periods. The perception was that it was still changing conversations. And as you can see, the second quote suggested that conversations about diversity and inclusion were much further up the agenda than 3 years previously. They also emphasised in some respects that it had prompted action. So again, it had helped move forward diversity and inclusion practices and policies than before, and helped sharpen, if you like, the focus on, if you like, diversity. In time two, one firm had actually made eliminating the gender pay gap their chief priority for diversity and inclusion, and they argued that the regulations in the case of the technology company had actually had a huge impact. And they'd actually gone forward and established gender diversity targets in areas of the organisation with low female representation. So they'd established, for example, a 30% target of women in sales. This was actually a very male-dominated organisation. It was in tech manufacturing. They'd also established a target of 20% women in technical roles and 25% target of women in senior management. Interestingly, however, when you look at what happened over the 5 years, despite those targets, the proportion of women in the highest paying quartile hadn't really shifted. So that's quite an interesting conundrum and paradox, I think. So impetus for change, prompting action.
Sorry, Jeanette, to interrupt.
Yeah.
Perhaps you may wrap up, or I mean, start to wrap
okay.
up, because you should have, I mean, you're past the 15 minutes,
Okay.
but let's give you 2 minutes. And so you
sorry, I planned for about 20 minutes, but okay, the other aspect of this impetus for change was professional leverage. I mean, quite predictably, it had enhanced the status and standing of HR professionals. So the other interpretive frame was the notion of regulatory burden, and there were 3 angles of this. Firstly, the feeling that government, you know, didn't really understand the implications of its own legislation, that the government believed most companies just sat down, pressed a button and it gave you all the numbers. This was particularly so for small organisations which were on, where HR, it was argued, ran on a shoestring budget. This persisted in time too, so reporting was still regarded as a monumental task, even in time too. I'll move over this. Perhaps I can pick this up later on in the discussion, but they also saw it as a source of regulatory overload. They emphasised in key respects that it was sometimes a limited benefit. They were doing diversity and inclusion already. They felt that the regulations didn't really add much. They felt they were just ticking a box. This is particularly so by time too, that it become one additional piece of reporting legislation. It's just another piece of work now that we have to do, but it doesn't drive anything internally. And lastly, and I think this is important, they were pretty critical, I think, both, especially at time too, as the reporting exercise became established, that the government was doing very little with the regulations. So there was a fear about this in time one, that they felt that Brexit and with other issues that the government's mind had been elsewhere. But in time two, you know, this was even more accentuated. They, as one, the science organisation, the informant there said, a huge amount of work is being done by organisations, but the government itself has done nothing. Whereas the sector analysis we were promised, they haven't spoken to people who were doing it. They haven't made any changes. Again, the government should respond and improve the legislation. So I'll just end on that the interface between the regulator, i.e. the government, and business organisations had become over time a very uneasy one. So I'll just
thank you.
Thank
you, Jeanette. I'm sure we will have time to make questions I have already, but let me rapidly pass to our second presentation by Maddie Wyatt.
Yeah.
Okay. And Maddie is also a King's Business School academic, reader in diversity and inclusion. So yeah, exactly to the point of today's workshop. She is an expert on issues of equality, diversity, and inclusion at work, as well as organizational politics and political leadership. So, Maddie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I'm an organizational psychologist by kind of trade. So I come at this from looking at kind of what the challenges that women and ethnic minorities, and I also look at social class, you know, how these different groups get to leadership positions, what the challenges they experience in organisations. I look at that in a range of ways. So I wanted to talk about confidence today because it crops up in a lot of different projects that I look at. So and it's become a kind of a personal bugbear now. So I just wanted to kind of have a little bit of a rant, really. So, you know, from a very young age, women are kind of bombarded with messages about being underconfident. The assumption is that men and women are different in terms of confidence, and that men are confident and women are underconfident. And by becoming more confident, women and girls can overcome systemic barriers faced in kind of education and in their careers as well. We've seen this in the workplace with, you know, kind of these big movements like Lean In, where we're told to find your confidence. You know, we see organisational programmes that are directed at women, talking to them about developing their confidence, their self-belief, empowerment. And we've talked about empowerment today, and there's different ways that we can talk about that. And I'm hoping this kind of really ties in with this idea about kind of not making women vulnerable as a trait like vulnerability, but actually looking at the systems that create that. Mm-hmm. So I kind of wanted to look at this in a little bit more detail. I've also got a 6-year-old little girl as well, and she's already getting messages about, you know, which club she should join to increase her confidence. So I'm like, hang on a minute, she's massively confident. She doesn't need these kind of messages being delivered to her either. So some of the research on this, I had a bit of a literature search. There is research that suggests that women are less confident about career attainment. That makes sense. You know, when you look at organisations where men are at the top, it makes sense that you wouldn't be particularly confident about your chances of getting there too. It also shows that women are less confident in the inability for specific tasks, and we've had that the SAR in the news this week talking about how women don't like maths and things, and kind of these assumptions and stereotypes. And also research suggests that women are risk averse in more masculine domains. So there is kind of findings around that. But does confidence really matter in organisations? There's not actually that much research on this, surprisingly, but a nice study that was done by Risa in 2020, who's an economist, looked at hope for success, which she equated with kind of confidence, and looked at, and this was a panel survey over 7,000 people, and looked at how that related to predicted probability of promotion when you controlled for things like job opportunities. And what she found was that for men, if they really hope for success, it's a nice correlation with promotions, but it doesn't really pay off for women. So I was interested in this, and as I say, it's kind of cropped up in my data. I do qualitative and quantitative research, but today I'm going to be talking more about my qualitative research because it kind of shows the real kind of what's going on, I think, a little bit more sometimes. So I wanted to go back to some of the theory. I'm a psychologist, so if you think about confidence, you go back to Albert Bandura, who's like the godfather of confidence, and talks about theories of self-efficacy. So in psychology, I'm sure many of you know this, that self-efficacy relates to people's beliefs in their ability to perform. But crucially, Bandura makes talks about different types of self-efficacy, which a lot of the literature's kind of forgotten. Talks about generalized self-efficacy, and generalized self-efficacy is basically kind of a confidence across kind of lots and lots of different situations. It's quite stable, so almost trait-like. So it's not something that's generally going to change much or fluctuate. But then he then also talks about domain-specific and task-specific self-efficacies, and they're far more about kind of, you know, areas of confidence such as leadership, or it could be very specific tasks such as, I don't know, putting a report together or something like that. And so even then, just having a look at these different types of self-efficacy, we can start to think actually confidence isn't just a broad thing. We need to think about confidence, whether it's kind of a broader confidence or very specific. Also, when we go back to his earlier studies, we in his theory, we see that confidence could be quite important. He suggests that it impacts people's choices, their performance, their persistence. But I wanted to think about how we develop confidence as well. So he suggested that you could develop confidence through performance accomplishment, so doing things well, observing others, things like role models, verbal persuasion, which is things like feedback, and emotional states. So in a study with Eleanor Duldor at Queen Mary University London and with Joe Sylvester at Loughborough University, we wanted to look at one of these aspects, which was verbal persuasion, and we did that by looking at developmental feedback. So we asked the question, how is confidence talked about in developmental feedback for men and women, crucially when performance is equal? So we looked at the qualitative feedback comments given to male and female leaders. We looked at over 1,000 feedback comments provided to these individuals. And we used a kind of technique of machine learning to look at the different patterns about how it was talked about. We then went on and looked beyond the machine learning bit because we found that it was interesting, but we needed some human brains in there to really understand the content a little bit more. But one of the themes we did establish from this feedback was that confidence was spoken about for men and women, but just in very different ways. So I'll just provide some of the quotes from those comments. So essentially, women get told they lack confidence. So she needs to be a bit more confident, have a bit more self-belief. So we're thinking back to these kind of trait-like, generalised self-efficacy comments. The only thing that stops her delivering her true potential is that she lacks the confidence that she should have in herself and her judgment. She doesn't seem very outgoing, proactive, really rather quiet. So again, kind of tapping into these kind of trait-like things rather than skills necessarily. She could also benefit from confidence building. She sometimes lacks confidence in herself without justification. She's very effective. So again, kind of disentangling competence from confidence. So women are essentially told they're kind of flawed when it comes to confidence, and it's very difficult. What we thought about, this is feedback. How do you react to this the next day when you come back to work? How are you supposed to change yourself? I don't know. Tell me, please, answers on a postcard. But men were told to display confidence. It's a very subtle difference. So confidence was spoken about for both groups, but men were told that sometimes does not express arguments or positions forcefully enough, wants to be kind of a stronger personality in meetings, could learn to be more assertive and confident in his opinions. It can be called a defect. I'm not sure it can. He's modest and might do well to be a better self-publicist, and being a little more forceful in putting his points across sometimes. Occasionally too much diplomacy is used. Display more obvious confidence in himself. So when we thought about this, actually it links more kind of into those domain and task specific types of self-efficacy. It's far more changeable. So when you get this feedback as someone in an organisation, the next day you can kind of have to go on a course about how to conduct a meeting, or do some kind of self-promotion work, looking at how to display that confidence. But it's far more of a skill than a trait. So yes, frustrating. So that was that paper. We put that out, and it kind of got a lot of attention in the Harvard Business Review. And we also found that in a study that we're now looking at, but the data's older actually, but we're looking at it now, we're also finding the same kind of themes come up. So in this study, we went into a professional services firm and we talked to people about how they make partnership. But we talked to the people trying to make partnership, but also their managers or the partners above them. And this comment particularly kind of summed up some of the things we were finding. So this is from a female partner who's already made it, and she's talking about someone below her that she kind of manages. And says her core points of development, like so many of us, so many women, I think, she needs to believe in herself. And I mean, I still have that as a major point of development for myself, but she needs to believe in herself. So this person's saying, this is the thing for women, we need to believe in ourselves, and this person needs to believe in themselves. But then we went to interview the person who she's talking about, and she said, my strength is that I combine high intelligence with high emotional intelligence. Arrogant as it may sound, I fundamentally believe that I'm smarter than most people in this building, but at the same time I have an ability to really build strong, deep and meaningful relationships with people. And we were kind of like, this isn't someone who's underconfident. So, what is going on here? Why are we keeping telling women that they lack confidence and self-belief? What we found in this data is when we talked to the partners who'd made it and the people trying to make it, confidence seemed like a linchpin, and particularly displaying confidence seemed like a linchpin for people's careers. So it, in the first example, kind of shoots people up. So this example is, I think she's taken more confidence from her promotions and progression. I think that has accelerated her expectation of becoming a partner, and I think people would endorse that. So it's not the competence here, it's literally having the confidence to do it has accelerated. The second example here is about the person who's talking about their own career, and says weakness is probably a lack of confidence. Actually, I have the confidence in a technical client situation, so they've got the competence and the ability, but for me it's about building the confidence to show that I can be a partner. So it's seen as this kind of, this is the one thing I have to do to make partner. It's not about competence or anything like that. And also it can kind of ruin your career as well. So a few years ago, I would have expected her to be at the forefront for some of this stuff, but she isn't. So why is that? There's something, has she lost her confidence? I don't know. So it's seen as a thing that makes or breaks your career in these discussions. So displaying confidence is seen as particularly important, but I think most of us in the room will know that if you display confidence, it's dangerous, right, for women. You suffer penalties, and this is kind of decades of research we know about this, and some of this was found in our research as well. So when we talked to partners and when they talked about the people who were trying to make it in professional services firms, this came up again and again. So I think arrogance was the word, because in many cases she would think she can do better work than partners, the audacity of it. I'm not saying that she comes across as arrogant, because I don't mean that. But there's that confidence that can almost be no, I know what I'm doing, and I'm quite vocal and pushy. So arrogance and pushiness. In terms of her personal style and directness, I think she just on occasion just needs to bottle that a bit. She's ruffled a few feathers. So women tread a very difficult line of, you know, we want you to be confident but not too much. And this comes out again, and this was going back to our previous study, and these are some of the contradictions we found in the feedback given to women. So this was about one woman, the first one, there was a niceness to her, a lack of arrogance. On the other hand, I thought she could be more confident. It's like, what are you supposed to do with that? And then about another participant, she lacks confidence sometimes when dealing with others, can sometimes be over enthusiastic about her ideas, sometimes needs to be more forceful. And you're thinking, if you had this feedback comment in your appraisal or your developmental review, what on earth are you supposed to do off the back of that? It's just really confusing and sends really difficult messages. So yeah, that's what kind of, these are some of the reasons why I find the whole confidence issue kind of a little bit soul destroying, I think. So I think overall, I don't know if I'm a bit short, yeah. I think the problems with confidence, essentially why it's so annoying is that it puts the blame on individuals. Organisations can then kind of, it's pushing this idea that we need to fix women to make them more confident. But when you think about kind of going back to those early theories around self-efficacy, if we're talking about, you know, are we talking about generalised self-efficacy, we're going to talk about domain or task-specific self-efficacy. Is this something that is changeable or not? Particularly when we talk about women lacking fundamental confidence. It's very much wrapped up in gendered expectations about behaviours. We should realise by now that confidence doesn't necessarily mean competence, and if we develop systems that reward confidence, we then reward overconfidence and risk-taking. That's not necessarily something that we want to do in organisations. And yes, it kind of just sets up women up to fail, because, you know, what are we supposed to do? It's very difficult, and doesn't necessarily give us a guideline on how to change or adapt or develop. Yeah, so I think that was kind of pretty much what I was thinking. And I thought, well, what kind of organisations do then? Because I think that's always what people want to know, is what are the answers to this? I think for me, it's not about fixing the women, it's about looking at the systemic issues. So you go back to that Bandura's theories about what can influence confidence, and thinking about performance accomplishment. So having a review of what you are looking at in terms of what is performance, what's being rewarded, and how are you rewarding that. Observing others was the second point. So I think, you know, it's really important to look for role models for women, but I think really more importantly, role models for men. So are we rewarding overconfidence and showcasing overconfidence as something that we desire in our kind of employees? Verbal persuasion in terms of actionable feedback. In our Harvard Business Review article, we did provide kind of begrudgingly, we don't really want people to talk about confidence at all, but if you must, we provided some examples about what kind of questions you could ask in developmental feedback sessions. So talking about the specific skills that you can develop confidence in, rather than just saying you lack confidence. What skills do you feel confident about? How can you better leverage that in your role? What behaviours can you use to demonstrate your confidence to others? Because it does seem a lot about demonstrating confidence rather than actually being confident. And the final area that Bandura discusses is emotional state, which is a bit kind of scary when we think about kind of women and emotions, and it gets a bit, you know, difficult. But actually, I think organisations need to think about how to make women feel more at home, and therefore kind of less like an imposter, because this all links to kind of imposter syndrome and things like that, by just kind of developing cultures where we don't feel out of place, don't feel different, don't feel like the token, and then those things should develop a natural kind of confidence anyway, even if, you know, I don't think we are underconfident, but yeah, that's basically me. So
thank you, Maria. I think, well, those two presentations really complement each other. So we will have now Rebecca Thomas as discussant. Rebecca leads on employment policy at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is Britain's national equality body. Rebecca has worked extensively on equality and human rights law with a range of regulators, public bodies, and the private sector. So Rebecca, thanks for your remarks.
Thank you, and obviously thanks for the invitation to participate. It's a really interesting opportunity to kind of hear directly from academics, from sort of cutting edge thinking and learning. I'll explain a little bit about the role of the HRC before I offer some reflections in terms of the kind of policy opportunities and challenges. So the EHRC is an independent body. It's a statutory body we were set up under the 2006 Equality Act to enforce equality law in Britain. Since 2017, we've also been responsible for enforcing the gender pay gap reporting regulations. Prior to the nightmare that was the pandemic, it achieved 100% compliance with those regulations as a result of our sort of compliance, engagement and outreach work with employers. So what we do in addition is also kind of monitor progression or regression in relation to the various sort of international human rights treaties that the UK government is signed up to. So obviously there's a direct read across the Sustainable Development Goals there, particularly SDG 5 in relation to gender equality, but also, and I have to check my notes, SDG 8 on decent work. So though we don't actually provide sort of commentary or analysis in relation to that, the kind of the human rights framework that we monitor and aim to kind of uphold and progress and realise rights are kind of firmly entrenched in that. And I think it's particularly interesting that we've got a conversation here about gender pay reporting and the use of data and how that can be used to drive action, because there is a lot of consideration, particularly from organisations like the Equal Rights Trust, about the importance of kind of data-led endeavours to address inequality and to contribute to the progression of the Sustainable Development Goals. So just you know, kind of drawing upon the insights that Janet shared, I think there are a number of challenges in relation to the gender pay gap reporting regulations. The driving point essentially was that getting organisations to report on what's happening in their organisation provides a really sort of useful insight. It's basically a transparency measure. What it doesn't do, though, is necessarily drive action, is enable organisations to understand what are the factors that are causing their pay gaps. So, you know, sort of separately, I think there is a real need for more concerted effort on understanding or supporting employers to help them understand what is their pay gap data saying and what actions can they take, what lawful actions as well can they take to address some of the drivers. And some of the drivers we know can be addressed through things like increasing the offer of flexible working at all levels across an organisation, or using positive action measures to address underrepresentation. You know, others today have been talking about the concentration of women in low paid part-time work. That's a core sort of contributing factor to pay gaps. So as I said, the kind of another challenge is the sort of the administrative challenge, and Janet's talked about the kind of this perception of a regulatory burden. And I think it's interesting, obviously, when the gender pay gap regulations were introduced, that came off the back of a voluntary reporting mechanism that basically had about 16 people and a dog participate. There was really, really low uptake, and that's why this kind of, it was spearheaded that we would implement a mandatory reporting requirement. And that obviously has sort of posed challenges to employers in the kind of the early stages, but the Government Equalities Office in Britain, which so basically owns the kind of the policy and legislation in relation to gender pay gaps, it has just done a post-implementation review of the regulations. It's something they have to do every 5 years on sort of regulation or laws. It's not been published yet. I'm hoping it's about to be published. But what they identified was that the kind of there was little evidence in terms of the administrative burden after 3 years, because employers are now kind of in the swing of things, and that actually it was proved, there was sort of emerging evidence to demonstrate its impact, that it was effective. They cite, and I can't remember the academic research, but they estimate around a 15 to 90% reduction in pay gaps as a result of that. But obviously there's going to be wide variance depending on sector, organisation type, and also a lot of the factors that Janet was talking about. So as I said, the administrative burden hasn't necessarily been identified as an issue, but the government has said they will continue to monitor that. What we're seeing equally, though, is a kind of a broader recognition across government about the need for more robust data on pay and employment gaps. So there is a voluntary reporting framework on disability. There are proposals afoot to introduce a voluntary reporting requirement on ethnicity, which is looking to kind of model itself on the gender pay reporting regulations. And these, obviously, as I said, they've been kind of consulted upon extensively. And the kind of initial feedback is that employers are like, well, you know, if we're going to do it, or we may be doing it already and it's fine, but actually if we're going to do it, we'd rather do something that we're kind of familiar with. Obviously, the impact of the pandemic has thrown everything up. And I think one of the challenges, and we've seen this as a regulator, one of the challenges for us in terms of ensuring that the organisations are reporting, we suspended our enforcement action in 2020, and we gave an extension to the deadline last year. But what we're seeing actually is that the pandemic has seen organisations fall out of scope with the regulations. So we're chasing to find out who do we need to be enforcing against, who do we need to be encouraging compliance with. We also see some of the challenges, and it was interesting because Janet made this point in her presentation about kind of turnover within HR managers, where institutional knowledge is being lost because people have left either the organisation or they left the labour market for a whole heap of other factors. So there are real challenges there, and that's a challenge for the EHRC and also for government in terms of its regulatory work. One point I would like to make, though, and it goes back to this point, the data in and of itself is a blunt tool, but actually organisations collect data on a range of different metrics anyway. So why would you not do it in relation to your people, to your talent, to your human resources? Business collects data on marketing stats or sales or financial outputs or whatever. So I think it's about using that data in a really kind of pragmatic and meaningful way to inform the action that's required. The Commission is really, really supportive of mandatory action planning. It needs to be time bound, they need to be target driven, they need to be monitored, because not only does it help an employer kind of set out what it's going to do and to demonstrate its commitment to greater inclusion and to address inequality, but actually, again, it's a kind of an accountability mechanism. The challenge that we have there then is, how do you effectively enforce or regulate something that is going to be different for every single organisation, depending on its size, the nature of its workforce, the nature of its industry. So that's just some reflections on the gender pay gap reporting. Moving on to your presentation, Maddie, which again I think was fascinating. The Commission again has done a lot of work on the challenges relating to leadership and to increasing women's participation in senior roles. And I think there are kind of a sort of a couple of points, and I think these are the kind of the two key things for me, and I'll come back to one of them, which is about the need for greater government action on some of these challenges, is that actually a lot of the time these are factors beyond an employer's control. So if you think about sort of perceptions, negative perceptions, they're entrenched at an early age from whatever, and we have issues relating to kind of educational choices, kind of career choices, the impact of sort of, kind of infrastructure challenges. But what we've done through our work in relation to sort of increased representation at senior levels is to emphasise the importance of kind of really clear and robust and sort of measurable and objective selection criteria, for example, so that employers looking to increase the participation of women at senior levels or to kind of address issues relating to a lack of career progression, focus on skills and not traits, and that you're kind of trying to sidestep the issues relating to sort of bias or negative attitudes. I think what was really interesting was the point that you touched upon too, which was the kind of the feedback from the senior colleague who went, oh well, this is a failing of my own. And actually it's true. If you look at what's been happening in terms of sort of government and industry attempts over recent years to kind of increase board representation, something like I think it's the FTSE 100, maybe it's 350. Let's go for 350. If it's 100, that's fabulous. It's something like 30% now representation of women on boards. But I think the issue, there's less clarity on what that's doing in terms of driving change and opening up kind of the pipeline and increasing opportunities for colleagues. And obviously, if there's evidence there that these kind of negative perceptions are being reiterated by women in leadership roles, then that there are kind of clear issues that need to be picked up. And I think one of the challenges particularly is that there's been, if you look at sort of kind of policy thinking in relation to this, there's been a lot talked about things like unconscious bias training. And there were things like the McGregor-Smith review on race race inequality and increasing the progression of ethnic minority people into leadership positions. That noted kind of the structural historical biases that affect ethnic minorities and women and other groups, from progressing. And there came along with that a recommendation for the government to develop free unconscious bias training. But the HRC has done research which shows, well, it's kind of limited impact. It kind of helps in raising awareness. It doesn't fundamentally change attitudes. So I think, in terms of a sort of a government policy response, there is limited there. What it can do is look at the kind of the wider context, the infrastructure issues that are contributing to sort of inequality and prejudiced attitudes. But ultimately, I think it's for the employer. I think it's really interesting to hear about employer actions to address some of these disparities. What I will do is just end on the fact that the UK government back in 2019 had a gender equality at every stage strategy. So what that did was set out a number of commitments across a range of different areas, including education, including childcare, addressing pregnancy and maternity discrimination, increasing flexible working, all of these things that we know are ways that will facilitate women's participation in the labour market and will address pay and employment inequality. And it's all gone very quiet. So, I couldn't possibly, that was published in July 2019, Boris Johnson, December 2019, may or may not be connected. They're clearly connected. But the point is that there is a lack of cohesive, coherent government action to address gender inequality in employment in Britain at the moment. So I'll finish there, and thanks very much.
Thank you. Amazing complementarity of the presentations, and Rebecca, your views. Yes, so much to do. Sometimes it's not an issue of not knowing what to do. So I will open the floor. We are kind of tight with time, but and I would like to give the floor back to Jeanette and Maddie to respond to some of the comments by Rebecca. But is there anyone who would like to? Yes. Okay.
So self-employed women, there's an estimate that the gender pay gap actually stands at 40% at the moment, which it's difficult to measure. Then all sorts of problems with that because we aren't working in large organisations. Of course, we're working for ourselves. But I mean, it's a question for Maddie really, because one of the things that we're told, and this is conversations that I'm having with unions that represent self-employed workers, is that it is the fault of women because we're not confident enough to go away and negotiate proper pay for ourselves. This is. It's a problem with sectors that women are largely self-employed with. But I also know from talking to the pharmacists union that women pharmacists are being offered about £100 a day less than male counterparts. Now, you can't tell me that a pharmacist isn't well educated and reasonably confident. So I just thought I'd bring that up and see what you thought.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, it's also a bit of a question for Maddie, and you kind of touched on it a little bit, Rebecca, which is I was interested to know about the findings of that confidence feedback and whether you looked at it and whether it was skewed at all by the ethnicity and social class of the people who are getting the feedback and also giving it, I suppose. So whether that made an impact on whether they were being commented about being underconfident or overconfident, and what we know about those biases, which I know you talked about as well, Rebecca. Yeah, that's very good.
Thank you. Yes, Jill?
Sorry. I just wanted to ask both Janet and
Maddie?
Rebecca, whether you thought if we were still part of the EU and going to have the Pay Transparency Directive, whether that would make any difference.
The counterfactual, we call it. Any other question? Yes, please. Perhaps your telephone is too close to the mic. No. Okay. No. Yeah.
That's better. Hi, I'm Lynn O'Connor. I work for Sage Software, and I'm really active in thinking about how to help to close this gender gap for women globally. So I've got a startup that I've been working on with some colleagues for some time. And we want to take that to market, but that's a side issue if anyone wants to talk to me about that. But well, I suppose there's two things I wanted to say. Was one, as somebody who has worked on the gender pay gap since its inception and not actually calculated the figures, because I always had a reward manager to do that for me, fortunately, but I am really grateful for it as a practitioner, because I think it really drives the change, and that is down to the organisations who pick that up and work with it and push it forward and really want the rigour behind it. And where the values come is when we've gone really deeply into the analysis to work out why is the gap, what's created the gap or the reduction in the gap, and which of those factors are levers that we can influence and which are not. So I'm just in support of it, actually, generally, sort of just a point to say. But the other thing was about confidence, and having worked, with women for a long time and trying to help them, progress in their careers. One of the things that I feel really strongly about is confidence. I get quite angry. I've got a 16-year-old daughter, and I think I think it's a massive factor of situational confidence. So actually, I'm a confident person as a general notion. I think I've developed that over time, but I'm very confident in some situations and in others I'm not. And those environmental factors, so, and thinking about male-dominated environments where, the boys' club's running, how confident do you feel in that versus a really empowered situation? So I think that I'd like to take the conversation away from or reduce it from it about the difference between men and women, and make it more about the environment in which we can flourish, because how do we get people to flourish, and confidence being part of that. So not necessarily to answer, but just wanted to put those couple of reflections I feel quite strongly about into the room. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will go back to Jeanette and then Maddie for final reflections or answers or what you would like. But again, we are eating up the time of this last panel. So Jeanette, the floor is yours for some minutes. Yeah.
I seem to run up against time.
Yeah, so sorry about
time
that.
constraints. Anyway, I think there were about 15 questions. I'm just going to say a couple of things. One is, if I can just respond to Rebecca. I mean, there are a number of things that she said. First of all, what's the problem in organisations collecting data? Well, there's no problem in organisations collecting data, and I think that a lot of organisations, particularly large-sized ones, have very sophisticated HR data analytics. But I guess, the issue that they talk about is, the way in which they had to migrate their kind of payroll data into compensation, that they'd never had to do that before. They couldn't use, their compensation data. I mean, I'm not a reward specialist, but it was extraordinarily difficult. But yeah, you're right. These things normalise over time, but nevertheless, what I picked up, there was still residual concerns about the regulatory burden. So I think that's interesting. Also, they wanted to kind of, get the government to respond to their concerns about anomalies in the legislation, which I don't think has particularly happened. So yeah, you're right, it has normalised, but I think from my perspective, it's still there, or certainly from the perspective of my research. I think Jill raised the issue of the Pay Transparency Directive, and I'm going to be very absolutely honest about that. I don't know, because I don't know the details about the Pay Transparency Directive. I don't know, it's an interesting issue about the interface between the EU and national legislative regimes and so on. But I mean, given that the gender pay gap, one of the rationales for it was to usher in greater pay transparency. I think that's an interesting one, and I think I've noticed that Jill Rubery has argued for quartile pay gap reporting, and it's certainly what a number of the firms that I studied were doing voluntarily. So there may be something in there. One thing I just would want to, and then I'll finish, is that I do think that firms, and I've looked at what's happened to the pay gap and also employment in the firms. We talk about the gender pay gap, but we don't link it with employment. And I think the European Commission has made a powerful argument that you've got to look at the gender pay gap alongside gendered employment inequalities, and that you can have countries with quite low pay gaps but have very low labour force participation rates for women. So we've got to look at the two things together. Also at the organisational level, I mean, I've got firms that you know, their pay gap's going down, but their female representation in the upper pay quartiles is very stubborn. It's hardly moved over 5 years. So I think that's very interesting. I do think we've got to bring the two things together. I think that's very important. I don't think we can just focus on the gender pay gap in isolation.
Jeanette, great. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Maddie?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess I'll come to the point around the whole pay negotiation issue. I think, yeah, it definitely speaks to the issue of confidence, and there's a lot of assumptions that women just don't ask for what they want. I do know there's been research in Bayes Business School. I haven't got the names on the top of my head, but I can find the paper for you. And they do find that actually women do ask, but they don't get. And also more recently, there's been a paper by Juliet Baer who talks about the fact that women have to adopt different negotiation strategies because of the way that women are perceived in terms of how they come across to other people, and therefore those strategies can be more or less successful, but also quite resource intensive in terms of doing it. So I think I don't think it comes down to women not asking and being confident enough. I think it comes down to how those things are received and whether they get them. In terms of intersectionalities with ethnicity and social class, we didn't look at it in that data set, in that first data set, but we did in the second data set looking at partnership. We looked at ethnicity, and in actual fact that paper's, I mean, confidence came out in that data, but actually that paper's more about what how people perceive career paths and whether it's open to them. And one of the big findings from that is that the minority groups within that firm basically can't see what the career path is supposed to look like. So I think a lot of this comes down to, you know, I guess feeling like being an imposter, feeling like an imposter within organisations, and I think that relates to social class. I've got a paper, I think I saw it stuck outside, that looks at social class as well, but not necessarily confidence, but it talks about how people feel completely being an outsider in both work but also at home when they've class travelled. So if you work in a bit of a posher firm than your background, then you feel a bit out of place at work, but when you go home everyone thinks you're really posh because you work in that posh firm, and it makes people, you know, it makes you constantly have to act, and it is quite stressful. So I think that kind of sense of feeling out of place really links into that context specific type of confidence. But I think coming to your point, it's really down to organisations to really think about the structural constraints around that. It's not about making people more confident, it's about providing contexts and situations where we feel more included. So that's down to inclusive leadership, and also getting a critical mass of people that don't look all the same as white men, perhaps.
Certainly. Thank you very much. Great panel. Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. So we rapidly transition, thank you very much, to the policy panels. I will invite Martina, Ilva, Praha, and Rosie. Yeah. No, let me move as well. Martina, yeah. So next to me.
Just to bring the chair over.
It's a little bit wet. That's
fine.
I can deal with the
wet. It must have been the one that the accident
No, that's
one.
fine. Wait, I've got a tissue. I'm waiting. Sorry to be so bossy, and I should use that word. Pushy. Thank you.
Okay, welcome. So this is the policy panel to close this afternoon. And we hope that this policy panel will be able to carry on the conversation we've had over the afternoon, bringing in the policy lessons and tapping or continuing some of the questions that were left unanswered or opened before. So I will present our distinguished panel. First, I have Martina, and I cannot read. So, first, I will present Martina Bisello again. Martina is research manager at Eurofund, a tripartite European Union agency based in Dublin. And Martina has published many studies on labor markets and gender gaps in Europe and has shown many of them to us today. Then Rosie Campbell. Thank you. Is Professor of Politics here at King's College London and Director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, internationally renowned for her work on barriers to women's participation in politics. Prabha Kotiswaran is Professor of Law and Social Justice here at King's College London. Her extensive publications cover issues of feminist legal studies and transnational criminal law with a focus on developing countries. And lastly, Ylva Bergström, I hope, is a lecturer in finance at King's Business School and researches gender and inequality in the financial services industry. So just to kick a start, and perhaps we go round and then we become a little less organized, yeah? But the first general question, and perhaps again starting with Rosie, is given your expertise and in light of the discussion this afternoon, what do you think are the main challenges in reaching the SDG 5 targets by 2030, either focusing on the UK or Europe or internationally? So what do you think, where are we with regards to SDG 5?
Well, that's a massive question.
Just take any.
I mean, we've got a lot to do to try and reach those targets in that time. And I think in some ways, if we focus on the UK first, we're not thinking about some of the biggest problems that globally women face. I mean, obviously the issues that women face globally vary by context. And for example, there are huge countries in the world where violence against women and girls is limiting their access to paid employment, etc., etc. But if I just take a step back from that and perhaps think in the UK, I think in the UK, I think one of the biggest risks is complacency. Is Rebecca still with us from the HRC? I think she was talking about the current policy environment. And, if we're going to reach those goals, there has to really be collective action. And Jill was recommending tightening legislation and the kind of data that's collected. If anything, we're seeing a weakening of the environment rather than the galvanizing force that we need. At the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, my colleague Minna Cooper-Coles published a report last year funded by the UN Foundation comparing gender pay gap reporting regimes in 6 countries. And the UK is fantastic in terms of the transparency, but actually when you look at various other factors, including enforcement and narratives around what you're doing, we've fallen way behind. And so if we're going to have any hope of meeting those goals, there has to be a real push. And I, at the moment, don't feel terribly optimistic that's on the cards. Although everyone here, there are things we can do.
Okay. Where do you think, I mean, yes, I mean, the massive question, but let's take it step by step.
Yes, I'll try. So I want to say a little bit about, I think, a couple of the goals in SDG 5 that we haven't had a chance to talk about today. I think the first one, I'm glad Rosie brought up the question of violence against women. So I think the glass is sort of half full, because I actually think that many states have registered the need to tackle violence against women. And certainly this is the story of, the law in India, where we were forced by sheer public protests to change the laws against, violence against women. So there is certainly recognition on the part of the government and just completely seismic changes in the law. However, I think, and this is where we need to have like a course on SDG 2.0, the 1.0, the case has been made, but what is the reality of these laws? And I think it seems that it has fed into the recognition of violence against women, has fed into certain conservative agendas, which have produced highly sort of draconian criminal laws that in fact then are undermining women's freedoms. The freedom to migrate is countered by, anti-trafficking law, which prohibits women from migrating across the world to earn a livelihood. If you're talking about rape law, by increasing the age of consent, then you're actually, punishing women for asserting the right to sexual choice, you're criminalizing adolescent sexuality, for instance. So I think there are some unintended consequences of pursuing, some of these SDGs. But I think related to this highly carceral project also is one of the means SDGs that you talked about, which is that, building up economic resources of women. I think there, in fact, governments have done a very shoddy job, and certainly in the Indian context. And I think these are closely interrelated to recognize violence against women, to promote, equality agendas, which feed into conservative political projects, but at the same time, doing very little to deal with economics. So if you consider women in India, and I think this goes back to what Janet was talking about, it's not just about the gender pay gap, it's whether you have access to paid employment. I think in the Indian context, the labor force participation rates are so low, 18%. So you really, so this is a very sanitized world where you're talking about gender pay gaps. We are actually talking about women largely in the informal economy that can't rely on the market, can't rely necessarily on the state, because the welfare state has a very peculiar formation in many developing countries. And if you look to the family, which is that we have absolutely no recognition of women's work within the family, and lack of matrimonial property rights, for instance. So actually, there's high levels of economic insecurity that women actually face in many developing countries.
I think I would like to follow up afterwards on what is this conservative agenda taken, or how it shapes then what is can be included there and what is leaving. But before that, I will pass the floor to Ilva.
Thank you very much. I think I'd like to start at a policy level, because we're talking about the targets and the goals, and we're talking about how countries have signed up to them, but still there are only, according to my research, only 10 countries in the world that have gender equal policies. So how can we possibly ever get there if we don't create the policies that are inclusive for women globally in all countries? I'm lucky to be from one of the countries that has gender equal policies, but we're still stuck with the perception problem, and we're still stuck with gender bias in the workplace and in society. Now, this very importantly includes parental leave, and we have to, for goodness sake, stop calling it maternity leave, because a child has two parents. It could be two women, two men, a man and a woman, or a combination of carers that take care of the child. And it's not fair to exclude 50% of the person who's given life to that child from the right to parent. And that's how our society is built up today. So I think those are fundamental things. Then the other point that I wanted to make, something I started to think about more recently, is that by excluding women from the economy and from the financial system, from employment, what we're doing is we're still reinforcing the need for women to use beauty and sex appeal as a currency to receive financial protection and financial security. And that is just terrible. That makes women weaker, and it makes them obviously dependent on men. A man is not a pension, that shouldn't be the way to the pension, but by upholding the society, and that is done through law, it's very difficult for this to make progress, I think.
We are opening so many doors. What an interesting conversation. Martina?
Yeah, very interesting. I'm afraid I'm going to open even more doors, but they're all interconnected. So hopefully in the end, we'll have the full picture. Well, a couple of points, a couple of challenges. to which we have two important policy initiatives in the pipeline at the European level in terms of directives. One is related to the issue of unbalanced distribution of unpaid care work, and the other one it's more related to women in leadership position. So with respect to unpaid work, I mean, we've seen from this morning presentation, at least from my side, that care work is a woman's work, both inside and outside the labour market. And our own data from the European Quality of Life survey before the pandemic showed that, I mean, for certain type of unpaid care task, women, I mean, they are disproportionately taking the burden, and for childcare is up to 50% more than men. And we collected some data from during the pandemic as well. Of course, we can't fully compare with the situation before, because these are online data, so not kind of fully representative, but we can get a feeling of what happened throughout the pandemic. And we can see that there has been an increase in unpaid care work, of course, especially during lockdown period with the closure of schools and childcare facilities, but a kind of consolidation of the traditional gender roles. And yes, in some cases, fathers have taken up more unpaid tasks. But if we look actually at the type of tasks, these were mainly either grocery shopping or gardening. So it's really not the childcare as such, which is still on women's shoulder. And it's interesting because if we look at the dynamics and changes within couples, the only case where we can see really a significant uptake of fathers in terms of childcare tasks is when the father was working from home, teleworking, and the mother was not. So the father was basically left at home. So of course, in that case, if you have also in the middle of a lockdown, that clearly has an effect. So it's to be seen the extent to which short-term effects then are gonna stay in the future. And in this context, it's interesting that the European Commission, and it's an important step forward that the Commission developed and is planning to launch a European care strategy, where it's going to look at it's a comprehensive package that is going to look at different aspects to tackle the issue of care work, both paid and unpaid. And one specific element is the revision of the so-called Barcelona targets. These are quantitative targets for participation in childcare that were set back in 2002 by the Council, and now are going to be revised because, on average, they have been reached at the European level, but there are still huge discrepancies across different member states. So that's something, because the availability of affordable and good quality childcare is clearly fundamental. Second point, very quickly instead, in relation to women participation in leadership position, decision-making position, and managerial position, kind of more in general. Well, in terms of managerial positions, we know that women are still underrepresented. I mean, only around 34% of women's are of managers are women in Europe. So that's an issue. We still have underrepresentation in terms of entrepreneurship, and self-employed with the employees. We also have some positive developments happening. For instance, if we look at the positive developments in terms of progress in the Gender Equality Index, which is produced by the European Institute for Gender Equality, we see that these have been mainly driven by progress in the domain of power, which looks at power in terms of economic and social power, and especially one indicator that where we saw really significant in progress and improvement, it's on the representation, women representation on company boards. And the thing is that that's related, is linked to those countries that implemented quotas. And this goes back to a discussion that is now again taking place at the European Commission level after 10 years of silence, of proposing a new directive to implement quotas on representation of women on company boards. So we can see there is some member states reach a provisional agreement. So now we will start the negotiation as well with the Parliament. So it's it is something is happening after a long silence there as well. So we expect some progress happening on that side.
Yeah. If I gather from your answers, there were, I mean, emphasis on challenges, but also most of you went straight to policy. But also, and connecting to what Rebecca mentioned, there is, and the previous panel, there is a design issue of the policy, and there is the political will. No, so perhaps we can think about those two dimensions when approaching or continuing our conversation. For example, Rosie, you focus on the equality in the workplace, and of course on leadership. How would you think of measures and eventually policies that would give us more women in leadership roles? Don't tell me it is a big question because you are the expert.
Well, I mean, I think Maddie's still here somewhere. I totally agree about this problem with, oh, there you are, the fixing the women approach. And I think the gender pay gap reporting regimes, however they're organised, and there are other ways of doing these things, can create an impetus for a conversation, but they don't bring about change on their own. They're measurement tools, and they're more effective if they include action plans, if they include representation, as well as just pay gaps. But I think if we want to see effective change, we have to find ways to tackle culture. And you can try and fix your gender pay gap or your problems with lack of women in leadership in organisations by recruiting more women in at different levels and recruiting women from diverse backgrounds in at different levels. But if they get there and find themselves in a culture that isn't inclusive and is toxic in various ways, be that in sex-based harassment or bullying culture or contests of masculinity, those women will exit. And so it's not at all effective. And so really these policies are only effective if they create a real impetus for organisations to want to be seen to deliver change. And then behind the scenes, they need to be implementing programmes that they actually evaluate actually work. And I think I heard various people talking about training and initiatives that sometimes not only are not effective, they send us backwards. Implicit bias training, sometimes tick, it's done, we're all fixed, and it goes backwards. Actually, the organisations that bring about change use things like the gender pay gap as a metric for change that they're measuring, but then they actually are beneath the surface really monitoring both quantitatively in terms of those numbers of pay gaps and representation, but qualitatively by going back in and doing independent face-to-face conversations around what does it feel like to work here, or exit interviews, why you left. And it's only when you do that I think you're going to really see the change sticking.
But let me follow up. What do you think about quotas in leadership positions? Because we also see that women dominate at the base of the pyramid, and they are lost in their way up.
Well, this is one of these rare occasions in this room where it's actually helpful to be a political scientist, rather than I often think I'm sort of backpedaling to try and catch up with you all because I'm not a psychologist or an organisational psychologist. But in politics, quotas for women are ubiquitous around the world. I mean, in the UK, the Labour Party employs them, and the SNP has recently said it will employ them. The Liberal Democrats have. The Conservatives have not quite done so yet. But, around the world, quotas are very, very common. And what they do is they kickstart the process. And people instinctively, we often think, well, I don't like the idea of quotas because it's not meritocratic. But we can all see from the research evidence that the existing situation isn't meritocratic. And I just frankly haven't got the patience to wait until my grandchildren are around for us to get to the point that we have better representation. So I think quotas are a way of accelerating the pace. And they can be really effective. But say, look in the UK with the kind of 30% club and Hampton Alexandra and trying to get more women on boards, you've got to think about how you do that, because a lot of those women on boards are in non-exec roles. They're not in the decision-making roles. So we always have to be pushing for progress. You get so far,
but then you've got to be evaluating, well, what have we done, and actually where can we push next? And the 30% Club are now pushing to say, okay, well, we need more women in the pipeline and more women in these more powerful positions. So yes, that's my answer.
Excellent. Okay, good. Prabha, you are the only one in the panel to focus on developing countries. India, I haven't had the chance to focus on Latin America, I have to say. But you started talking about the issues that or the challenges you identify in India. One of the really, or two of the issues associated, or I've seen about women's gender equality in India is one, the distribution of unpaid care work, and the low, and as a consequence, a lower labor force participation, and the other is certainly the high proportion of women who work in agriculture. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, but I just wanted to echo what Rosie said, which is about the habits that the habits inculcated by cultures and quotas, and it's not strictly in the business context, but certainly in the Indian context, what has happened is having quotas and political representation at the local level has produced habits of voting amongst women in local elections where they care and being represented. They don't always occupy positions of power. Their husbands might be, running the decisions, and they're just proxy heads. But it produces a political culture which then allows them to participate in elections. And actually now, the argument has been, certainly in India, that the voter turnout of women is higher than that of men, since 2009, and this has huge ramifications in terms of what kinds of issues get put on the policy agenda. So I just wanted to kind of echo that in a very different context, but equally helpful. So I think on the question of unpaid work, I just want to step back a little bit, because I think the developing world context requires a different treatment of SDG 5.4, which is obviously, and a lot more about this than I do, but the understanding that unpaid work is restricted to unpaid domestic and care work is clearly problematic in agricultural economies where women perform a lot of subsistence agriculture. And I think so unpaid work is often used as an explanation to say why women don't participate in paid employment, as a supply side issue. But I think there's more and more research that's showing that actually there's less demand for women workers. So that is what needs to be fixed. And also in terms of measurement, I think if you look not just at unpaid domestic and care work, but unpaid economic activity that women contribute to, the question is, are you measuring that accurately? So every time you see a statistic on female labor force participation rate, it could just be that women don't perceive their own work as work. So it's a question of, so feminist economists have done incredible work to show that if you ask the right questions in the right way to the women, not to the head of the household, then in fact the labor force participation rate figures could be very different. Where it is 18% formally, actually in interviews it might emerge to be 50%. So I think one always has to keep that in mind. But I think that being said, because women perform so much, are already doing so much work in the informal economy, and that's not something that's captured or protected by labor laws, right? So it's always outside of the scope of regulation. You can't collect any kind of data that you're able to do, because this is simply outside any kind of zone of counting or measurement or reporting to regulators on, and it's quite deliberate in some ways, I think. And interestingly, although this is largely the case, I think there are some very hopeful there is cause for hope. And I just want to say that most recently the Supreme Court last week has recognized paid care workers, women who are part of the large integrated child development scheme in India, perform childcare for children below the age of 6, offer nutritional support and so on. They have been given the right to gratuity under labor laws. So, the extension of labor laws to paid care workers who would otherwise be excluded, I think is very positive. And I think similarly, there have been a lot of this has come actually from the courts that have said that we want to view unpaid work as a form of occupation, for compensation and, cases where women are killed in motor accidents, rather than just offer like a small amount to the dependents of the women. Courts have actually said, housework is an occupation. So I think that gives you constitutional legs on which to then enter family law, enter different domains of the laws. And I think the final thing that I'll just say is that what has been interesting is that in the process of sort of state elections, there's now been a move to offer unconditional cash transfers to women, and I think it is a recognition of their unpaid work. There's an implicit recognition that welfare outcomes improve if you actually, and which has always been the logic of conditional cash transfers for a very long time. But I think now there is a recognition that just offering unconditional cash transfers will result in improved welfare outcomes. So I think all of these add up to, greater recognition of the unpaid work that women actually do.
So much to react to, because I've worked with Indira Hirway a lot on time use surveys, and Indira is an expert in time use surveys in India and has emphasized that time use surveys could produce the right data on women's labor force participation as opposed to the labor force survey, and I'm so glad that this court thing, this new ruling. You see, I don't have any language in law, but that ruling it is the AGA when the workers,
yes, the Anganwadi workers,
exactly.
Yes.
So excellent. I think it's as you said, is promising. Ilva, I introduced you as an expert in financial services, and the information I have is that in many places, not everywhere, like, I don't know, construction, but financial services are in many places, especially where they pay well, not female dominated. What was the word? A predominantly male occupation. So what can be done to address that?
Well, firstly, I'm going to display my confidence by showing you my book that came out in March, which talks exactly about gender in financial service and inequality in the industry. So just thank you, Maddie. And I wanted to again start with let's start with the quota question, because we talked about that earlier. So I argue that until the mid-1970s, there was 100% quota for men in financial services. Because, I mean, these statistics, I say them all the time, so you might be bored with me by now, but I used to work in this for many years, and then I work in fintech. I started a fintech business, so I'm used to working in environments where there are actually no women clients or women in the organization, if you like. But it wasn't until 1973/1975 that women in the UK can open a bank account without a male signature, and they couldn't become members of the London Stock Exchange, which was founded in 1698. So in my sort of book and in my research, I sort of say that it's very difficult to make it inside a penis for a woman. It's really, really hard. And you can see the shape of the buildings, and they look a bit like that, don't they? So that's the first point I wanted to make. So that means that there are no role models for women to follow, and obviously much worse for ethnic minorities. And particularly, it's always the women at the bottom. So it's the women in ethnic minorities that do the worst as well in terms of careers in financial services. So it comes down to gender all the time. Then secondly, we talked about gender pay gap, and aren't we doing great? We went from 27% to 15 point something percent. Guess what it is in financial services? It's, if you look at just base salaries, it's 35. If you look at bonuses, including bonuses, is 66%. Right? We're talking about the most powerful industry globally, the industry that can really role model inclusive practices, because without access to bank accounts, which we still in many parts of the world, India is one of the places, of course, which has increased a lot in India. And we got this fantastic woman, Mehta, who became the first member of the Bombay Stock Exchange, for example, and lots of examples of great work going on there. But without access to the financial system, we are at a complete loss. So we can stand to sort of be role models for changing the world and improving the world and providing equal opportunities for everyone. But it's really, really difficult to be a trailblazer. It's really hard to be the first person doing something. And when you see a woman leader in financial services, you wonder, how did she make it there? What is she going to be like? Why is her hair like that? What is she wearing? When you see a man, it doesn't matter what he looks like because he's supposed to be the leader. So those are probably the most important things I wanted to mention about financial services.
Thank you. And Martina, you mentioned several, I mean, these two policies, but perhaps you would like to elaborate on the gender pay gap or the measures that could be put in place in fact, we go back in this sense to the conversation that was left opened and the last panel.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I think that I showed you a graph earlier on in the presentation, but it's nice to elaborate a little bit more on it, especially about the determinants, really the factors that drive the gender pay gap. And we did some analysis recently at the European level, and I think there are some striking findings in terms of what explains the gender pay gap and what we don't know that is still unexplained. And it's basically 2/3 of the gender pay gap, based on our analysis, still unexplained for a variety of reasons. It's either because it's unobservable characteristics or call it discrimination, or unobservable elements, or also lack of data. This is an issue that was mentioned also earlier on. Even with the best data that we have on earnings, there are still some important elements that are not captured and which are very significant when you look at differences by genders. For instance, in most of the cases with data at the European level, we have information about the tenure within organization, which are clearly an important determinant of pay progression. But we don't have, for instance, information on the cumulative length of professional experience. And when you're looking at women and career interruption because of childcare, that's clearly an issue. So even when I say that there is a large proportion of the gap that it's unexplained, it's also unexplained because we need better data. In terms of what we can say, and we can observe that determine the gender pay gap, it's essentially three main determinants. On the one hand is the participation in relatively lower paid economic activities, then the overrepresentation in part-time work. That's something that was mentioned earlier in the case of the UK, and also the underrepresentation in supervisory positions. So these are three very important aspects. Now, there are again some relevant positive policy developments at the EU level. The European Commission recently proposed a directive for pay transparency. The negotiation with the Parliament have taken longer than what expected because of different positions of political parties, but they finally reached an agreement actually at the end of March, paving the way now for negotiation at the member state level. And this pay transparency directive, I think it's really important, exactly because it goes in the direction of enforcing then some really enforcing mechanism in terms of pay transparency and making it mandatory, which is exactly what we need. So the details of the directive itself, of the legislative text, are still to be fully agreed. But I think that it's really promising that we have in place those elements that I think what I gather from the discussion based on the UK experience were missing. So hopefully on the right path, but it's not a straight line.
Not yet there. Okay, we have to close, and I think that what I would like to do is to ask each of you for one takeaway, either from what you heard, from or to complement something you said before. And I want you take the floor whenever you want. I won't go, Rosie, for you to open. So, what would you take away, or would like us to take away from today? I'll let you think. And then we go for drinks and conversation, and then we have many other takeaways.
I think I might start then just by saying I think it comes back to thinking about parenting and participation in the labour market at the same time. You can't fix one without fixing the other, because you can't remove the institutional bias against hiring a woman of a childbearing age or a woman with children without ensuring that parenting is equal. And with that comes childcare, affordable childcare. And here, interestingly, in Sweden, where childcare costs, I mean, a nursery place in London is about £2,500 a month, something like that you have to pay after tax. In Sweden is £150 per month. And guess what? The Swedish government loses no money because they have women in the workforce paying taxes. It's a win-win-win. And you then role model to your children that parenting is for all genders and business is for all genders.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah.
I'm ready, I think.
Okay, go ahead.
I think from hearing the different presentations and I suppose there's a variety of things going on here today. There's what academics do to research these problems, and then there's what policymakers and activists call for in order to try and bring about change. And I think that there has to be a combination of metrics to measure progress, but also this incredibly important qualitative work that various different people have presented. And I was really struck by your point about the informal economy and what gets collected. And you can't really understand what we need to collect unless you go and talk to those women about what their everyday lived experience looks like, and then think about how can you quantify it. And I think as we're pushing for policy, we need to ensure there is that iterative process going on.
Thank you. Very well said as well.
Yeah, I just want to say that, it was riveting hearing everyone's presentations today, very informative. I guess I was just trying to think about what is it about this moment that makes things unique, right? We were thinking that it's a moment of crisis, right? And if care has been undervalued for so long, and if, feminist insights into, this could be a conference about feminism, right? It's about SDG 5, but, rehearses many of the debates that feminists have been having in various disciplines for a very long time. And there was a sense we got during the pandemic that something was different, something had shifted. But it feels like the window of opportunity is slipping us by again. And I'm just trying to think about, and very quickly you can already see we are back to academic business as usual, which is the interaction between business and the law and the regulatory burden. These are all the familiar moves and the debates that we've had for so long. What can we capture as life sort of is going back to normal to put care back on the agenda in some very, fundamental ways? What would a care manifesto, as some people have talked about it, really, really look like? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it has been really fascinating discussion, and for me, it just reinforces the idea that there's so many interrelated issues, and we really need, from a policy perspective, we really need like a comprehensive set of measures, like taking into account, if we look at the pay gap, we said we need to look at women participation and what determines women participation, unpaid care, and so on. So we really have to have the full picture there. So on the one hand, policy-driven change, but also kind of bottom-up change in terms of changing the organizational behavior, attitude, how we perceive confidence gap by gender and these things, and for that I think we also need more men in the room when we have this kind of discussion, which is always a bit of an issue, but I think that we are getting there.
Yeah. And I think that we need to put these issues back into the agenda when they are not, and when they are, keep on pushing. I mean, the conversation shouldn't sleep. The doors opened shouldn't be closed, and the political momentum, if it's not there, should be created. And I hope this afternoon has contributed to that. I've enjoyed very much being here, and so thank you very much to you for. Thank you to our presenters and commentators, and so now and thank you all here. So with this we close. Perhaps Damien.
Just a final word. Well, a big thanks to Valeria Esquivel, who came from the ILO, sort of informally, well, on holiday as well. This is a holiday. So, this is what she does on holiday. Who knows what she does on holiday. So thank you. Really a big job that you've done today. So thanks very, very much. I'd also like to thank Costa, who is combining his audiovisual skills with now SDG expertise. That's great. So, and Mariam Chaplin outside, who's helped with all the events. Sophia Bianchini behind the scenes, who had got COVID on Monday, so couldn't be here to enjoy our first workshop. I want to advertise also the next 2 SDG workshops on SDG 8, Decent Work and Inclusive Growth, and SDG 10 on inequalities. They'll be on the 25th of May and the 1st of June. Exactly the same sort of lineup of academics, policy experts, practitioners, hopefully similar sort of audience. And if you can also be here, that'll be great. You can find all the information if you just put SDG events, Kings, you will find that. But big thanks to all our participants today. It's really good.